let's get right into it and we'll get to know each other on the show.
That sounds perfect. I love that.
All right. Yeah, here we go. Hunter, I'm excited to be collaborating with you.
I'm excited to be working together. I think we've been very much on parallel journeys.
So I'm surprised we haven't crossed paths before. Well, we have crossed paths. You didn't know about it. I read your book years ago because people in my audience were sharing it with me. It's definitely one of the things that I wanted to talk about with you on the show today. But we even had like similar career paths for a while. Are you still doing any tutoring?
Those bills, they don't pay themselves. It's a terrible, terrible thing, Brett.
Really? You're not full time into podcasting yet with Mixed Mental Arts?
No, I mean, I think Mixed Mental Arts was Brian and I really, it was just sort of our garage project, and it was really just our opportunity to leverage his massive fame
Right.
to be able to talk to all of our intellectual heroes.
Mm-hmm.
And then at a certain point, we talked to 200 academics and we're like, okay, there are a lot of these ideas and they're not moving. So how does it get packaged together into a form that the public can appreciate and understand? And then we're like, oh, we actually have to grow this into a real business. And so we've successfully had to start paying attention to things that we'd previously ignored. Like we never did advertising. We never did, really paid attention to the website, very basic things like, we just left money on the table because that just wasn't what our focus was. And
Sure.
so now it's like, oh, okay, we have to actually grow this sucker and, start paying attention to sound quality much more and start improving all these different parts of the process. So, yeah, I mean, now we have to actually grow it into a business. We even registered for an LLC, which is fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it sounds like that's similar to what I've done over the last few years, but I know I'm still leaving money. Not just I'm leaving money all over town. But
Jesus, Brett,
yeah.
Let's fill up your pockets.
I know. I'm working on it. It's a slow process. There's a lot to learn doing this as a business. And I've learned a lot in the last couple of years. I kind of transitioned out of tutoring maybe 2014. I just stopped answering the phone. It's entirely a word of mouth business. Yeah, I picked up doing the show full time around that point, and it's been good since then. But there's a lot more to do.
Well, and that's the other great connection here is that, of course, you are from the Granite State, where my co-author Katie O'Brien is from.
Yeah, she went to Pinkerton Academy, which is a beautiful little school that used to compete with us in football and baseball.
Where did you go?
Exeter.
Oh, damn. Yeah.
Oh, whoops. Not Exeter, not Phillips Exeter. Exeter,
No.
Exeter High School.
Yeah. No, because I've been up to Pinkerton, otherwise known as the Katie O'Brien Memorial Shrine.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. Like, I thought Brian was famous, and then I went back to Pinkerton Academy with Katie O'Brien, and I was like, this is what fame is. Like, this is a level of fame that I have never seen.
So Katie O'Brien, for those who don't know in my audience, she is your co-author for a book that you wrote now like 6 or 7 years ago called The Straight A Conspiracy.
Yeah, I think it's 5, but it was called The Straight A Conspiracy, and it came out of very much the same experiences as the School Sucks Project, where we were tutoring kids and they hated school.
Yep.
And they weren't doing well, and they were stressed out and miserable. And so we basically were just like, okay, what's the deal here? How do we fix this? And Katie and I focused on what we thought were 2 entirely separate parts of the problem. Coming from the science, I majored in biochemistry, so my focus was like, these kids are saying things like I didn't get the math gene, or I don't have a natural ear for languages that are not supported by the data.
Right.
And so, I went and nerded out and would run around the science and figure out what did the science know to sort of try and undermine these very unproductive beliefs and to figure out what we know about learning. And Katie, whose biology teacher in high school said that she wasn't good at biology, but that it was okay because she was going to be a humanitarians major.
Yeah.
So she was coming at it from a totally different perspective of like, these children are miserable. Like, just look at their faces. They're so stressed and so unhappy, and this is not how life should be. And what we came to realize is that although these seemed like two entirely separate problems, they're actually the same problem. And that's because of this bit of neuroscience that we call Descartes' error, which we stole from Antonio Damasio's book, which is just the idea that thinking and feeling are separate. And in fact,
Right.
thinking and feeling are linked. They've always been linked. But many of us from our culture just internalize this assumption that, like, there's reason and that's separate from emotion. And in fact, the two are intrinsically linked, and unless you've had some sort of brain surgery.
Right. Yeah, I ran my show on Descartes' era for like 4 years. Just having lots of conversations with people, mostly around politics and around some of these school issues. I found that parents were, resistant to looking at some of the failures of the public school system, and people who had been through the system didn't want to acknowledge that either. Like somebody had gotten over on them, I think was maybe the emotion. So I started to realize just from having these conversations, not really very tactfully for years, even years before I started the show. And, around 2006, I also found my way to libertarianism, which is something that's going to come up on in our conversation too. So I was like real pedantic and overbearing with people and using a lot of shame and moralizing in how I talk to people about political issues. So I didn't have the best approach to these conversations. But what I realized, and probably like in retrospect, I realized that it was also a problem for me, is that, people can either be rational or emotional. And when they get into this emotional way of thinking, they can't be rational. And politicians know this, and they always try to direct people towards the emotions. And then I think we were doing a series called Logic Saves Lives, and this idea of the elephant and the rider came up, which you're probably familiar with, right? For those in either of our audiences who don't know what that is, the rider is the rational voice, but he's small and he's able to control the elephant, but the elephant is the emotional voice and much larger and more powerful, and you have to kind of tame the emotions to have the reasonable conversation. And it was doing that show, which I think was about 2 hours long, where we really dug into this problem. It made me realize that the two are not, like a binary choice, that there's a lot of intertwine between the two.
Well, crucially, the rider can't get off the elephant.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can't just go and wander around. And a lot of people think that that's how their brains work, but in practice, they're being driven by feelings that they picked up from their cultures that they don't even realize they picked up. And I think what's helpful is, the audience of mixed mental arts will definitely be familiar with the rider and the elephant, because I've droned on about it ceaselessly. So
good.
They've had it inflicted upon them a whole lot. But I think the thing that Haidt does that is super helpful is even to, because the problem is that these words like reason and emotion, people start to have such strong feelings about them and they mean different things. And I think the more useful thing is to distinguish between reactive and reflective, right? So, either you're being reactive and that's your elephant charging and going nuts, or you're being triggered, or you're being reflective and you're thinking slow and you're really sort of reflecting on what makes sense and sorting through your feelings and seeing whether they're appropriate to the situation. But, this is all terminology, and ultimately, I think what's great about terminology is that the wisdom of crowds will decide. You float these things out on the internet, and then people will be like, I like what Brett said better, so I'm just going to do that. And that's great. Power to you, whatever works for you.
Well, you take these terms, thinking fast and slow, which comes from Daniel Kahneman. Yeah. So I actually did a series after the election when I was just astonished with everything that I was seeing in the news. And I tried to extract some of the lessons from thinking fast and slow and apply it to the political scene. And people found it valuable. And a lot of people actually wound up buying the book, which has very little to do with politics. It's mentioned here and there. But it's an incredible resource. It's an incredible realization that's really so simple and seems like it should be intuitive. But a lot of people in the moment really just can't catch on to that in their own thinking, it seems, myself included.
Well, a lot of this comes down to, and this is why the work on cultural evolution is so important. IQs have gone up 200 points gone up 30 points in the last 200 years. So if you gave somebody from 1815 an IQ test today, they would essentially be borderline retarded. They would score a 70.
Right.
And so, that's because we are part of this process of cultural evolution. And just as, technology is always improving and, agriculture is improving and all these other things are improving, our cultural software is also improving. But there's a big lag right now between where humanity's cultural software is, essentially where its intelligence is, these very simple little rules of thumb, like there's fast thinking and there's slow thinking, and where our technology is. So we've sort of been thrust into an environment that requires a level of sophistication that we're not ready for.
Right.
And, I think a lot of our job, and I think where, ironically enough, tutors or former tutors like you and me
Right.
are ideally positioned for this, is to help break down these ideas and then package them to really move for a mass audience. So that people can make better decisions. Because the problem is that, what's great about tutoring, I think there's a couple of great things. One, kids are shitty at rationalizing. They're the worst rationalizers around, where you watch them try and justify their behavior, and, they haven't learned bullshit well enough yet. So it's pretty transparent what's going on with them. And then you sort of cut right to the chase and are like, what are you feeling? Like, how did you do? What's really going on here? Do you really understand this or not? Or are you just sort of waving your hands? By contrast, of course, an academic who has learned an immense amount of fancy words and all of that is amazing at rationalizing their behavior and disguising when they don't really know what they're talking about.
Indeed, yeah.
And bullshitting in a way that the average person doesn't feel qualified to challenge them or say, do you really know what you're talking about? And, when we get into the conversation about libertarianism, I'll have to tell you one of my favorite stories of all time, which is the invisible hand wave story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's just interesting that you say that, and it lines up with my experience so perfectly. I worked in a boarding school for years, and after a while, it was like I wasn't even mad about the lies anymore. I was mad at how bad they were. Like I would be like, oh, come on, and it wasn't like I knew that the environment was such that the kids would always be trying to, get over on teachers and other staff. I mean, that's the nature. It's, you're putting them in a cage to a certain extent, and they're trying to survive. So there's going to be some behavior that we would consider suboptimal growing out of that. But I was just disappointed with the lack of effort and creativity that would go into the lies. But then, later, and like now where I talk to a lot more academics in my, daily life, I walk away from conversations and I go, shit, I just let somebody talk circles around me, Yeah. And I think I just nodded the whole time, when it's basically, it's the same kind of behavior at its root. One is just more practiced than the other. It's interesting.
Well, it's, I had a conversation with Chris Ryan, who wrote Sex at Dawn, and this was an offline conversation, or an online conversation that wasn't recorded, so I don't know how much of this I can say. But he just talks about, and I'll keep it generic, but he just talks about the degree to which certain academics engage in intellectual rope-a-dope. Where, they're not really taking a punch. They're just it's just this endless game of avoiding being intellectually accountable for the fact that you're wrong. And the problem is that science is supposed to be about being wrong faster, right? You put your ass on the line, you put your hypothesis out there, you test it. The world then has the opportunity to redo those experiments and make sure whether your findings are actually verifiable. And you're supposed to be intellectually accountable, right? It's maximum intellectual accountability. And the problem is that that's not where academia is, right? That's the theory of science, but that's not the practice of science. And so that's a large part of why I've been pushing for a scientific reformation. But in practice, I think what's exciting is the fact that, podcasters, people like you and me, can just drag these arguments out into the public eye and then essentially break the ideas down and make them so accessible that the public is then informed enough to be able to hold academics accountable when they are just bullshitting.
Yeah, it reminds me, there's this boxer. There was this big fight, I remember. I think they were lightweights. You probably know more about this than I do. Maybe like within the last 2 years. And one guy, he went like his whole career without getting punched. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but I think about him, when I think about academics like that.
Oh yeah.
And he did great, and he wound up being very rich and successful, but he never took the punches. And I think there were some questions around like, well, what kind of a fighter would he be if people could hit him? No one could, no one could hit him. So
Yeah, and that's the basic. By the way, never, it's called mixed mental arts, and I hang out with people who like MMA.
right.
But this is a really good example of intelligence, right? And my lack thereof. Because and it's part of what I appreciate now, sort of being in this community. I've started doing some boxing and kickboxing, and it's just so great to suck at things.
Oh, absolutely.
It just reminds you how very limited and compartmentalized your knowledge is. And you're like, I've read all these books. I feel so smart. And then, I actually just wrote something about this, because the most basic question of what is intelligence? And I just always go back to the etymology of the word, which is, it's interlegere, to choose between. And so, that can be the difference between wheat and chaff, the difference between shit and shinola, or it can be between knowing when to duck, when to bob, when to weave, when to throw a jab, when to throw a hook. So, my intelligence in the realm of, martial arts or boxing is very low.
Sure. Yeah, mine too. Considering I can't think of this guy's name, and he's like one of the most famous boxers from the last decade. But let me circle back to something that I heard you say a couple minutes ago. My curiosity has been building about. You talked about IQ going up,
Yep.
30 points over how many years?
200. So 1815, if you gave somebody from 1815 an IQ test, they would score 70 now.
Okay, that's very interesting. So do you feel like we are, to some degree, like even though there's probably things that we're encountering that we're not prepared for in this technological age, you feel like we are evolving to keep up, to try and keep up with the changes around us? Because I've said things that I think are a little bit self-defeating, like your brain is not prepared to handle porn or Facebook, or, both of them going on together in separate windows on your computer. How do you feel about that?
Well, so I think the most useful historical analogy is what happened around dueling.
Mm-hmm.
So, Europe had a culture of dueling for centuries, right? And, they would all duel and they would fight to the first blood. And then along came the gun. And successfully, there were better and better and better guns. And now, fighting to first blood with a gun is a very different thing. Because very often, you only get to get shot once before you die.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this bloodbath that happens in the aristocracy and the sort of well-to-do set, where they are just like, they're doing what their culture has always taught them, which is if somebody offends your honor, you challenge them to a duel, and then you fight. But all these people are dying. The Burr-Hamilton duel is just one example. And then over time, the cultural norms around dueling change. And suddenly we move from celebrating the behavior of like, that dude, like his honor was insulted and then he fought and it was awesome,
mm-hmm.
to people would show up at the duels to laugh at the idiots who, were now like shooting at each other. And so part of what's happened is that, the internet, right, there are these old intuitions around debate. Like, this is how we solve our problems. We debate. And, everybody has sort of brought these intuitions into the world of the internet with them, of like, we're going to fight, we're going to have a disagreement, and then I'm going to out-statistic you. And isn't that fucking awesome, how
right.
much I can out-statistic you? But it's very much, we're in this social media bloodbath. And inevitably what's going to happen is, and I think that our job is to sort of midwife in this process, is that people are going to start realizing that that behavior is not helpful and that we should be using the internet differently. And crucially, that great New Hampshire woman, Katie O'Brien, has defined and established the perfect metaphor for what this moment in history is, which is that it's humanity's first family dinner. And so, it's very much like any family dinner where you don't see these people very often, you haven't talked a lot, and then suddenly you're shoved together at a table and you're like, who are these people? Am I really related to them? What do they believe? They're crazy, right?
Right.
And you want nothing to do with them, and then, arguments and fights break out, and, it's the things that families always fight about. They fight about inheritance, like who did what to who when, who is like being a shitty person. How do you really feel about me? Which is what all the racism, sexism conversations are about. And, there's just a constant process of everybody triggering each other.
Indeed.
And,
Yeah.
And at a certain point, and the mixed martial arts community has sort of moved on, right? And the point is that for us to essentially model what the culture should be, where, rather than doing that, like that behavior isn't impressive, and you just start treating all the random strangers on the internet as your relatives, because they are. And then you just start talking out your differences and trying to understand the other person's perspective. And I think that's the culture that will emerge, which is an actual global village. But, as Joe Rogan has said, it's very much in its adolescence. And
Indeed, yeah.
A lot of this behavior is very adolescent. And, it's like everybody trying to tell a more impressive rationalization for their behavior.
It's an interesting way of thinking about it, that we all sort of slipped back to a less mature time in our lives, right? Where we go out and we engage in this behavior, and I've done it too, which is nothing like I would act in my mid to late 30s, but is exactly how I would have acted when I was 14 or 15.
Well, and on top of that, right? I mean, it's like superpower, right? Like the internet gives you a cloak of invisibility. It's amazing, right? Like, and, obviously, I mean, I think that's what people never talk about with superheroes, is that the reality is, if suddenly I was like Brett, right? Like, here's the deal. That cloak of invisibility from Harry Potter? Totally a legit thing. Here you go. Have fun with it. Now, the point is that I think at least initially, most people would abuse that power. Right. And you'd fuck around with it, you'd see what you could do with it, and, you might cause some mischief. And then at a certain point, the novelty of that would wear off, and you'd be like, oh, this is really bad. And then you'd start figuring out, you'd realize that it's much more satisfying. How do you use that productively? How do you use it for good? So I think the point is that, historical precedent, and this is where the really, really long view that comes out of a book like Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success is so valuable, because it shows you that cultural evolution has always been happening, and that very often, and the whole dueling thing comes from Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is about the evolution of norms around violence. And these are long, long historical processes, and what happens is that, sometimes one technology, like the gun, right, the ability to do violence, races ahead of the cultural norms. And so that's what's happened here, is that, there's an uneven development where, it's like a growth spurt. We've had this massive technological growth spurt, and our cultural norms haven't had the chance to catch up. But crucially, the ideas exist, like thinking fast and slow exists. It's just that most people are not going to read Daniel Kahneman's book and Antonio Damasio's book and John Haidt's books. And so we have to break these ideas down and make them super, super accessible.
Absolutely. So are you just using principles of the past to suggest what's going to happen in the future, this evolution where people catch up to this technology that's sped way ahead? Or do you actually see signs either in, the mixed martial arts community or elsewhere that this is beginning to happen?
I would invite anybody to come to the Mixed Martial Arts Facebook group. And what you'll find is that it's a very, very different spot on the internet. Because, inevitably the people who have been attracted to it are people who get this sort of messaging and who want to have those conversations. And we have self-described Christian fundamentalists in there. We have Muslims in there. We have new atheists in there. We have people coming from science, people who are conservative, people who are liberal, and they're all having great conversations where they talk out their differences. We have anti-vaxxers, and then people who think that anti-vaxxers are idiots. They don't like the word anti-vaxxer, I should recognize. So, people coming from a very, very wide range of perspective who are just using the internet the way that it's supposed to be used, which is for all of us to talk out our differences.
Yeah, how are you guys doing with social justice issues? That seems to be the big hang up in my Facebook community currently, or for the last year or so.
Well, the point is that this is all very silly. Like that's what I think. So it depends. There's like real social justice issues, and then there's like like racism is a thing and sexism is a thing, and then there's like the the silly behavior of college kids,
Right.
Around pronouns and cultural appropriation and all of that sort of stuff. And this is again, I'm going to cite the work of another great New Hampshire woman, Karen O'Brien, mother of Katie O'Brien.
Mm-hmm.
So Karen O'Brien, at some point, Katie O'Brien is a very small child, is at the checkout, probably in Derry, New Hampshire, and she like wants to like have a candy bar, one of those impulse buy candy bars, and Karen says no. And Katie, for the first time in her life, decides to throw a fit. And she like throws herself on the ground and starts flailing and banging her arms in her little snowsuit and just like making as big of a scene as possible.
Right.
And Karen O'Brien leans over to the woman working at the checkout and says, "Have you ever seen anything so ridiculous?" And then the checkout woman and Karen O'Brien just start laughing at Katie. And suddenly, like, Katie's little brain, right, is like, this is uncomfortable. This is not what I wanted. And she learned a very powerful emotional lesson that day and never did it again. And so that's the point, is that these, I think that the ridiculous behavior just needs to be ridiculed.
See, I don't know. I'm on the floor in want of the candy bar at the grocery store, and people start laughing at me, like, just to put myself in the shoes of young Katie, I might see people laughing, and this totally relates to what's happening in higher education, and I think with a lot of the political left right now. I might say, I think I need to double down here. If people think this is funny, maybe I'm not trying hard enough.
Well, it depends on how you're doing the laughing, and a lot of this then comes down to power,
sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So Karen has a lot more, Karen and the woman behind the checkout have a lot more power than 3-year-old Katie. And so when that happens, that works. The problem is that, if you got a bunch of college kids or a bunch of professors, they have a lot of intellectual power. So, the problem is that if you just laugh at them, it isn't effective. But there are ways to do this. So this is one of the things we've been playing around in the mixed mental arts community with is, so take the cultural appropriation thing, right? So in fact, if you look at, Lena Dunham had this line about how, the students at Oberlin College protested about sushi and banh mi being cultural appropriation because they were serving it in the dining hall. Well, of course, that's a really ridiculous thing to say, because look at the banh mi. It's a French baguette with Vietnamese fillings.
I'm actually thinking, because I talked about this on the show when I was just astonished that this was happening. I said, there must be more to the story. I always want to give people the benefit of the doubt. So before I go to press with something just completely condemning this, which I did wind up doing after I looked into it, I think what it came down to was they were dissatisfied with the quality of the food. So it was sort of a roundabout way. It was a way of moralizing about the lack of quality of the food they were eating, more than like real offense about, an affront to another culture.
And the irony is that this is a group of kids who spend all their time talking about privilege.
Indeed,
right? And they're at a school that costs how many tens of thousands of dollars, and they're whining because their sushi and their banh mi aren't good enough.
Yeah.
So it's ridiculous behavior, and I think the key thing is that so for example, Lena Dunham said that. What's Lena Dunham's favorite food? Lena Dunham's favorite food is pizza, and pizza is the product of cultural appropriation, because pizza has wheat, which was from the Arabian Peninsula. It has tomatoes, which were from the Aztecs. It has cheese, which was probably developed by the Turks, and then it was all brought together in Italy. And so if you look at any dish, it's all based on cultural appropriation, or what, is what we call in the mixed mental arts community idea sex.
Yeah, I think that's fine. And by the way, we can tangent into absolutely anything, so I'm not going to
Yeah.
resist the temptation to go down this road. I think that the calculation when it comes to cultural appropriation is again about power. So there's recognition that yes, cultures come together and they share and they trade ideas, and one adopts the practices of another. The sensitivity seems to be when a culture is marginalized or oppressed by a dominant culture, and then the dominant, and this is me playing devil's advocate, of course, but the dominant culture then appropriates, like white people taking things from like hip hop culture would be a huge cultural appropriation problem. I think they would have to concede what you're saying about cultures historically just sharing ideas and sharing traditions, right?
Right. And that because that's what the evidence is. And if they're college kids, they can't like deny history. And also that's, how cultures are continuing to do that. So one of the great things that's happened out here in LA is that Roy Choi has made the Korean barbecue burrito, right? It's delicious.
Mm-hmm.
Can't endorse it enough, right? He's taken Korean food and mixed it with Mexican food trucks, which he loves. So he's taken two things he loves and he's made something new. But the key issue then, right, then really what are they upset about? They're upset about power. But so that's what we should be talking about. We should be talking about power and the fact that all power needs to be held accountable. And that in order to hold power accountable, you need to have enough education, enough information that everybody has enough understanding to be able to call out abuses of power. And if you want to focus on that, then I'm right there with you. But the issue is not cultural appropriation, right? The issue is abuses of power.
I think so. I mean, I don't like to psychologize or generalize, but Jordan Peterson's talked about this a lot as well, is that people feel this kind of internal discomfort or lack of satisfaction, and they project it outward onto the world, onto things. And a lot of these issues causing all of this commotion in higher education right now, they do seem to be examples of that. Like people have this discomfort with self. And so they turn it around and they try to find some, outside oppressor or aggressor. And it's a great way, and I know this from personal experience. I talked about it in a recent show, and libertarians do this with the state. You take whatever that uncomfortable feeling inside you is, and you find like a singular sort of monolithic thing to blame. Well, it doesn't have to be monolithic. It could be a bunch of things, but you find something outside of yourself to blame it on. And the further away it is from you, from being inside your locus of control, it seems like the better, because it's all the more perfect excuse, to not work internally, to not self-reflect.
So the issue is feelings.
Right.
Right? And the point is that children have feelings, and these people in college are children, and all humans have feelings. It's not a question of age, that they don't know how to sort through and they don't know how to make sense of. But the point is that we shouldn't be wasting our time engaging with their rationalizations and acting as if you have some point here. You have no point. Your point doesn't make sense. That doesn't mean that your feelings are wrong or that you don't have some reason for feeling the way that they do.
Sure.
But then let's talk out your feelings. Let's sort through your feelings rather than it's the same thing as in any disagreement, right? Brett, have you ever been in a romantic relationship?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes arguments get pretty heated and we're just saying shit to each other, right?
It has happened, yes.
Yeah, I have been there, you have been there, we're all human, we've all been there. And there comes a point in the argument when you stop just saying shit to each other and just trying to rationalize whatever it is that you're feeling, and then you start being like, let's actually talk about our feelings and what's actually going on. Mm-hmm. And then you start to unpack that, and then you start to be like, well, when you said that my mother was a bitch, I just felt like you thought that I was a bad mother, mm-hmm. right? And, and when you said that you thought that I da-da-da, and then you start to unpack all of those feelings. And that's what I think humanity needs, is that we need to stop just saying shit. And, that's the humanity's first family dinner. There's that moment where it all breaks. And more of us just start honestly talking about what we feel. And that's when we're actually going to start to make progress in this conversation. And it doesn't have to take long. It can turn pretty quickly. But it's really, that's the work. It's to sort through our feelings and to figure out, okay, what does a world look like that, sort of satisfies all of our different concerns? And where do we really know what we're talking about? And what is just some sort of cultural prejudice that I've picked up from my family, whether that be racism or sexism or feelings about the government or whatever it may be. And let's try and really get to what actually makes sense here.
Sure. Do you and Brian try to model that on your show? And maybe that's part of the reason why you're having success in an online community around lots of controversial issues? And if so, how do you do that? I mean, I've tried to do that on my show for years, talking about the inner experience and how it relates to communication. I've done a number of different series exploring that, everything from childhood trauma to Nathaniel Brandon's ideas of self-esteem to nonviolent communication. What are you guys doing?
Well, I mean, the point is that Brian and I have known each other for a very long time. The first house that I went to after leaving the hospital was the Callan house. So I've literally known Brian my entire life. And so, we, again, I think part of it is that there was no significance when we started this podcast, right? So it was just us talking, and then we talk with all these academics, and we were like, okay, what do you know? And then we'd learn whatever they learned. And increasingly, it's just been a question of us sort of unpacking our various cultural baggage. And just sort of coming from the place that everybody picked up shit from their mom and dad. And that drives your choices. And then at a certain point, you start to realize what that is. And so I think in large part, that's what we do. But then, when we have guests on the show, they're not always game for that, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. They're coming in, they've got a book to promote and a worldview and a brand and a thing, and they've built up this reputation of themselves. And when you try and have those sorts of conversations with them, and I've had some very unfortunate examples of that. I should tell you about my interview.
Will you try to go there? Will you make a practice of trying to go there with somebody you don't know? Because I have a lot of apprehension around doing that. I mean, there's been moments where people have kind of they've gotten vulnerable, and it surprised me, and I like it when that happens. But I'm always just a little bit cautious with not wanting to step over a line with people I don't know.
Well, and rightly so. I mean, some of these experiences have gone very poorly. They haven't gone well at all.
Tell me about one.
Yeah, well, that Peter Schiff would be a really good example of a disaster. So I've been sort of thinking about this and thinking about intellectual accountability and how do we really deal with all of this? And so, somebody, Abdul Bioud, who has been, he and I have been talking online for years, was like, you should get Peter Schiff on your show. And Peter Schiff is a libertarian. And so I was like, okay, great. We'll get Peter Schiff. So I look up Peter Schiff, see what his deal is. And I'm like, oh, this seems a bit silly to me. And I'll tell you why, we could look at that later in terms of my understanding of capitalism and my understanding of what Adam Smith actually meant and what I think, has happened to his work and how it's being misrepresented. But so I wrote up some of my thoughts. I sort of summarized them, and, sent Peter Schiff's assistant, some articles. And just, one of them was Capitalism's Dirty Secret, Greed Was Never Good. And, some other pieces, and floated in that way. And then proceeded to say, make sure that Peter, reads these. And I was trying to figure out what the mixed mental arts metaphor means. Does that mean that we're fighting our ideas out and that we're trying to challenge each other and that the best ideas will win? And so Peter comes on the show. Mm-hmm. And Peter, before the interview, I say, hey, did you get a chance to read that stuff that I sent you? And he said, what stuff? And I was like, oh, shit.
Yeah.
And so he then proceeds to start to just go into his spiel, right? He's got his book spiel, he's got his online podcast spiel, and he's just doing his spiel, and he's on and on and on. And then I started to challenge him on some of these things, and specifically, Peter wants to get rid of the FDA. And so I said, well, Peter, do you know why the FDA was developed? And he goes, well, I don't know, but I probably wasn't very good, right? So I said, well, it developed because of this. There were all these patent medicines being sold, like this thing Radithor, and there was this guy Evan Byers who, banged his arm on the way back from a Harvard-Yale game, and his doctor, who was getting paid by the Radithor people, prescribed him Radithor, and Evan Byers believed that it was working, and he consumed hundreds of bottles of this radioactive water. And then he was so radioactive by the time he died a few years later and had abscesses in his skull that they had to bury him in a lead-lined coffin. And the Wall Street Journal wrote an obituary saying the Radithor worked fine until his jaw came off. And so in the wake of this, the powers of the FDA were strengthened. And so I told Peter this story, and I said, what do you think about that, Peter? And he goes, well, the problem with the government is that the government is like a camel. Once it gets its nose underneath the tent, it just doesn't stop. It just goes all the way in there. And I was like, okay. And he kept on using this camel analogy, which I then subsequently found out was from Barry Goldwater. So this is a thing that floats around. It's from 1964. And then I said, Peter, I am totally down with you if you want to reform the FDA. But then we have to get into really figuring out what is appropriate and what's inappropriate. What's the baby and what's the bathwater? And Peter says, there is no baby. Or if there is a baby, it's so small, we should just throw it away.
Well, see, I think that's, and that to me is a weak argument. I don't understand why he, as somebody else who's not a fan of the FDA, I also have to admit, I don't know a lot about the FDA, so I probably wouldn't want to get into an extended debate about its merits. I know that Peter Schiff knows enough to probably trade anecdote for anecdote with you, where if you have an example of some guy, drinking radiated water until his body literally falls apart, that's score one for you and the need for the FDA. But then why doesn't Peter come back? It's because he's a smart guy. He's a very, very bright guy. He could come back and say, the FDA hung, all of these life-saving drugs up in regulation for years longer than they needed to be. And then there's a conversation about why that happens and why drugs cost so much, or, what have the failures of the FDA been letting things through that wound up hurting people along the way since its inception. And remember, the F in the FDA is for food. And holy shit. You look at this country right now, the health of this country, I think he could do better than just, using this government as a camel thing, because there's examples of that. There's instances where that is true, and there's instances where, that requires a little more effort to prove that, the nose under the tent. He
didn't do better. And his by the end of the interview, he literally spaced out, like his brain froze. Mm-hmm. And partly it's because, I was asking him about his feelings and I was asking him about his emotions. And the point is that, a guy like Peter Schiff is, again, amazing at rationalizing why he feels the way that he does. But when you actually sort of, poke underneath and, do that sort of work of really challenging the core foundational ideas, he didn't do very well, I don't think. But you can go back, you can go listen to the podcast, you can see what you think. Now, the core thing is that what you're saying is that there's, having since had many, many conversations with Peter Schiff fans and Peter Schiff detractors on the internet since, that, there's a difference between, is there too much regulation or intellectual property? Is intellectual property problematic? Do we not need that as an idea? Are there too many hurdles? That's one conversation. But is there any reason why anybody should be allowed to sell radioactive water and make promises that radioactive water can, cure your health, even though all we know it's going to do is going to kill you?
Can I think of any reason why that should be? Oh, no, of course not.
Right. And in the same way, if you look at countries without an FDA, you find that, for example, in China, there are all these silicone-injected shrimp that are being sold, where they inject the shrimp with silicone to make them look plumper. And listen, I love the free market, but I'm aware that there will always be snake oil salesmen. There will always
Absolutely.
be people who are willing to do unscrupulous things to try and make a buck. There's a big thing in Africa right now with plastic rice. So these sorts of, in an evolutionary system, parasitic behaviors emerge. And, all of humanity lives in an evolutionary system, and people will exploit ecological niches. And, markets, doesn't matter where you go in the world, marketplaces have rules. And there are behaviors that they allow and don't allow, and you want to keep them out. And the question is, how do you do that, and what makes most sense? But again, that's why I was saying to Peter, like, if you want to talk about, reforming the FDA, I'm right there with you. But if you're trying to pretend that, having no FDA is a good idea, then you have to really answer these very fundamental questions for me about what are the sort of behaviors that we see humans engage with in the real world. And, the Veinotte is an example. Another example, by the way, and this is why, in terms of challenging Peter's behavior, I think this is a really good and specific one. So Peter Schiff was born in the 1960s, and Peter Schiff has hands. I've seen his fingers, and part of the reason why he has fingers is because the FDA kept thalidomide off the market in the United States. And they kept thalidomide off the market by, there's this woman, Dr. Frances O. Kelsey, and she was called a fussy bureaucrat at the time. But, she felt that the data didn't support, that there were real problems, and she just really got a sense that, this company really just wanted to push its drug without first checking out safety. So if the FDA didn't exist, Peter would probably not have fingers. So or there would be a higher risk that he wouldn't have fingers. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, so just to zoom out from specifics here, I think we could agree that right now, you talked about markets. Right now in the public mind in this country, and apparently every country in the world, save Somalia, there is a market demand for government. People want government because they believe that the government is the answer to a variety of complex social and scientific problems that they have no idea how to solve on their own. So libertarians fall into this trap where they believe that if they want to engage in political debates about things like the FDA, they have to have ready-made solutions. So you could see like the overwhelm and the burnout and maybe even the cost in like social skills, communication skills in this approach. They have to have ready-made solutions to everything from education to health and human services to food and drugs. And, if they don't, they lose the debate. I think what people need to do who identify as libertarians or anarchists or voluntarists, they have to recognize that they are a tiny minority in a land where there is an overwhelming demand for government. And they have to ask themselves the question, what kind of education or information can I provide that reduces that demand, that allows this conversation to evolve, that people would want to think about other types of solutions beyond the use of force to solve problems, which does often have unintended consequences. But right now, they are just spitting into a hurricane. People do not connect with conversations about non-governmental solutions to most of these problems because most people live lives where they go to work and they want to maintain their yard and they want to care for their children and they want to engage in leisure activities. So they're not going to go through the ins and outs of the FDA. If the FDA is already there and it appears to work, fine. Stop whining about the things you don't like about the FDA. I mean, that's what most people's attitudes would be. So I think this has to be more of a project from the individual up. Like, I want to live freer, and here's why, and here's how I do it, and here's how I make it look attractive, versus, trying to take apart government agencies in a land where everybody else already agrees they exist. So I don't think about libertarianism as like a political project, like I'm going to go and reduce the size of the FDA and that's going to be some kind of victory while another department in the government spends $1 trillion a year on killing people in other countries or threatening to kill people in other countries. Like that's a way for me to just feel very small, to feel very powerless. And I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in as much freedom as I can have in my own life and making that look attractive to other people. And, you know, hopefully making people who think that I'm worth paying attention to or worth following want more of it for themselves in how they educate themselves and how in things outside of politics and how they choose their relationships and how they raise their children. That's what's important to me. So I would almost at this point, even though I used to love to get into it with people about these kinds of issues, the FDA, I would almost run away from conversations like that today because they are spectacularly pointless as far as I'm concerned.
I don't think they are spectacularly pointless if you have them at the right level.
Okay,
well,
yeah, go ahead.
If we have them at the right level. So part of what we, you know, this is where in the same way that college kids, you know, have these spectacularly complex rationalizations about their feelings, we all have, you know, all of humanity, Hunter and Brett and Peter Schiff have spectacularly complex rationalizations about their feelings about politics. So I think here's an opportunity for us to model some good behavior and to talk about our feelings about government and our feelings about the use of force.
Let's do it with education. How about that?
Let's do it with education. We could do it wherever you want.
Well, which is a government department. So can we get a running start by talking about the straight A conspiracy a little bit, and then that's gonna work us right into that part of the conversation.
Right.
So if I could just ask, so we'll bookmark that, and we'll definitely come back to it, and we'll build excitement in the audience. So this was a book that you wrote 5 years ago, and you and Katie specifically targeted it towards secondary students, high school students. What kind of success did you have with that target market? I'm just curious because I wound up, you know, I started my show in 2009 with that audience in mind and wound up attracting a lot of, you know, parents and people who are adult autodidacts and they just remembered being frustrated with the school experience. I've attracted a lot of people who are in college. But what happened with the secondary student market?
Well, it did well with the secondary student market, but like you, we ended up, of course, you know, people who are out in the world today went through the shitty school system and have, you know, so we've gotten, you know, a lot of adults who have resonated with our book, a lot of teachers who have resonated with our book. And then the most, you know, exciting and gratifying was actually we've gotten a lot of resonance from prisoners. And crucially, you know, there's this guy in Oklahoma who, you know, keeps on printing up copies of our book and giving them to prisoners.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, we get emails from these prisoners basically just talking about how, they wouldn't be in prison if they'd known everything in this book, you know, when they were in high school. And, you know, Katie and I wrote basically the book that we wished we'd had in high school. And that is the number one feedback, regardless of age, that we get about our book. Like, I wish somebody had told me this years earlier. So that's really, I mean, the point of the book is to teach people how to teach themselves, how to learn, unlearn, and relearn, to, you know, steal from a great Alvin Toffler quote that we've become obsessed with, because that really sums up what is the key to succeeding in the 21st century.
Right.
You know, we had an idea in mind, but in practice, all of humanity, I mean, our educational system is really structured around the industrial age.
Yep.
And very much in the same way that we were talking about with dueling or we were talking about with social media, you know, the technology has evolved and our cultural norms have not yet caught up. And so now the job is to reboot the cultural software and reboot everybody's intuitions around learning. Point is that we can't, and this is going to warm the cockles of your libertarian heart, we can't wait for the government to get its act together, because the problem is that in order to change the government, you have to change the minds of the people. And so the first step, step, is changing the minds of the people. And in practice, it's not like, you know, people in their 40s who, you know, drove a truck for years and years and years are suddenly going to go back to high school. So you have to figure out how to break down and make those messages so digestible that everybody can quickly access that knowledge in a fun, enjoyable way and quickly get up to speed so that they're prepared for this new economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would recommend the book to anyone in my audience. It would be a lot of review, but it's a lot of new ways of conveying very similar ideas. And it's done. Yeah, it's done in a way that is definitely very, very accessible. Like I was really happy when I looked at your credentials and Katie's credentials that you're talking about a lot of things from your experiences as tutors that I had figured out from my experience. Automaticity is a huge part of it. And I always used to talk about, paving new pathways in the brain and neuroplasticity. I loved, sharing that stuff with students because how their minds work, that was never a part of the conversation in school. None of that ever is. How their emotional state affects what they're learning, that's never a part of anything that's being, shared with them from teachers. And of course, the attention piece, avoiding multitasking. I remember putting multitasking on resumes like it was a good thing,
Yep.
when I started applying for jobs. So a lot of the lessons that I extracted from my experience as a teacher and a tutor are in the book, and I recommend people read it. When I first read it, it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, I had mixed feelings. I was, in the one sense, I was really comforted by this idea that was backed up by brain science that I was not genetically determined to be dumb. Now, when I graduated from high school, I wouldn't have said, I wouldn't have used genetically determined, but I thought that was basically just my lot in life, to be adult, because school had basically made me feel that way. And, I just said, okay, well, I guess I have to figure out, how to have a non-intellectual life. To hear the opportunities, and this is something that I've tried to convey in my show for years, that exist to many more people. Like, a lot of people don't think they can do these things. If somebody had told me when I was 17, in 8 years, you'll be a history teacher, I would have thought that was pretty funny. But it happened. So I was really happy that was such a big part of the story. The part I had more mixed feelings about was this idea is conveyed, and I don't know if you still stand by this or if I just misread it. Grades are a mark of intellectual success.
Well, I think that the key thing, and, since there's been more and more science that, I've experienced through the Brian Callen show that only just further clarifies what we were saying.
Mm-hmm.
And what we were saying is that, we had the opportunity to talk to Jared Diamond, which you want to talk about, like, lifelong intellectual crushes that, like, I finally got to fanboy out to. That was really exciting.
Sure.
But Jared Diamond told this great story about how he was at some point, he was in some mining camp, and the first tribe that he'd worked with in Papua New Guinea was the Foray tribe. And late one night, he hears some guy in the shed next to him typing away on a computer. And he goes and he talks to the guy, and it's like, turns out that he's from the Foray tribe. And the guy is doing all sorts of stuff on the computer that Jared Diamond doesn't understand. And it turns out that this guy's father was the first person in his village to read. And then this guy was the first person in his community to learn how to use a computer. And, even though after 46,000 years of isolation, they jumped and they got these much, much more powerful tools.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that, that the big differences between us in terms of intelligence are genetic is ridiculous. It makes no sense based on the evidence, especially when you look cross-culturally. So the question is then, what is a grade? What does a grade mean, right? And so what a grade means is that you performed a certain set of tasks. It does not reflect anything about your potential or anything about your capability. All it says is that you successfully perform this task. Now, that's a learnable skill, right? Like, we give out grades in golf, right? Some people get a birdie, some people get an eagle, some people get a hole in one. But the point is that, if it's how you react to that performance, we give out grades in video games. Mm-hmm. Right? I play Mega Man. We just had somebody in our community, Christopher Leon Price, wrote this great piece called The Art of Losing. And he talks about all the life lessons that he learned from Mega Man 2. And, Mega Man 2 repeatedly gave him a failing grade. He died again and again and again. but then he kept doing it until he got good at it, until he mastered and beat the game. So the big problem is that, the method of grading is such that, if you're really focused on skills, right, then you should be able to keep doing it until you beat that level. Okay, I beat Algebra 2. I beat physics. I beat, this history class. Now I know how to write a paper. But the problem is that, what much of what the educational system is based on is that it's based on trying to find special people rather than trying to raise the potential of everyone. And a lot of this comes down to something that Woodrow Wilson said back in 1913 or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Do you know the quote by heart?
I don't know it by heart, Brett, but if you do, I'm going to let you take it from here.
We want one class of people to have a liberal education. We want another class, a very much larger class of necessity, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks, unquote.
There you go.
He said that to a group of teachers. I think he was I could be wrong. People can fact check this. He wasn't president of the United States when he said that. I think he was the president of Princeton University.
I think he may have been governor of New Jersey at that point.
Oh, yeah, and that also possible, which would have made sense for him to speak to a group of teachers. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, whatever it was, the point is that's what the model is. It's designed around manufacturing a curve, and it's designed around finding a special class of people. And you look at the SAT. The SAT is a great example, right? So the SAT, it tests material that every student knows, or that a lot of students know, but it asks it in an ass-backwards way so that people are like, shit, this test, this is so hard. And, the examples that I always love is that, so people figure out averages, right? And it's mean equals total over the number of items. Mm-hmm. And so what they love to do is these problems where instead of it being mean equals total over number of items, that it becomes mean times number of items equals the total, right? And it's like, oh shit, we rearranged things and now you don't recognize it. And it's very much like doing a crossword where, I remember when I was a kid in high school, there was this big brouhaha because the Sunday Times changed the guy who wrote their crosswords. Like all these old ladies who had spent their decades and decades figuring out how the mind of this one crossword writer wrote, suddenly their skills evaporated overnight, right? Suddenly they were bad at the crossword because they actually didn't really know how to do crosswords. They knew how to do this guy's crosswords. And
exactly.
That's what the SAT is.
Yeah.
And it basically, but the point is that, could you sit down if you had enough time and sit down with a group of students who are currently getting, whatever, 1200s or, 800s or whatever, the score is that's the worst score you can think of, right? And could you sit down and patiently teach the material to them and all the weird little tricks until they get 2400s? Yeah, of course you could.
Yes. Right? Yeah.
So those Woodrow Wilson assumptions are the worst assumptions that we can have in the information age, because what we specifically do not want is a class of people who only do routine tasks.
Exactly.
Because routine tasks, crucially, are what robots and software do best.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was a big part, a later part of my wake up to the problems of school. I was tutoring almost exclusively the SAT and the ACT test. And I would have, kids in the classes that I was teaching, and you'd have one of these sort of multi-step problems where you'd have to find the area of a sector of a circle, right? Like a little pie slice, a little piece of pizza. And I remember, a kid an honors student who wanted to, I would ask the kids, why do you want to go to college? What schools are you planning to apply to? And this kid had some pretty lofty ambitions. And I remember in the middle of the class, he shouted out, "Nobody ever gave me a formula for how to do this." And I said, okay, well, math isn't magic spells. And it's not something, it's just given to you. Like this is critical thinking. You have to like inventory what you know and figure out how to apply it to this problem. And then, I realized like I was stunned by the feeling of powerlessness that these kids felt encountering what were critical thinking problems, and the lack of confidence they had just in themselves when it came to approaching an unfamiliar task, even though it looked like a lot of familiar territory. And what I wound up doing when we were talking about how to get a market share in a very competitive area in like the New Hampshire Seacoast region. And I said, why don't we talk about this test as being a kind of opportunity that can teach a lot of skills that school didn't teach. The writing portion of the test, where you have to write a persuasive essay, that's never taught. Nobody knows how to make an argument, how to, hold up a thesis as the capstone in a pyramid using, evidence and arguments. We could teach that. We could teach, these Latin roots that none of these kids are getting, and they can expand their vocabulary just by knowing, 50 of these roots. They could expand their vocabulary by thousands of words, their functional vocabulary at least. So we started to see all kinds of opportunities in this test. I actually stopped doing it because it was very repetitive. And I also felt like I was helping schools like feed kids into college who really didn't need to be there, and we're just going to wind up wasting, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was really disheartened when people would say, I don't know what I'm going to major in. That's an expensive way to find out. So there were things about the test that I really liked in how it structured those questions, especially those critical thinking math questions, which were always the ones that we skipped in our homework when we had to do number 1 through 33 odd. The ones right after 33 were always the critical thinking questions in the textbook, and we never had to do them. So, I saw an opportunity there that school didn't really help kids with. But I think it speaks to, what you're saying about there's other ways to sort people, and most people don't need to know how to think like that.
Well, but, the irony of all of this, right, is why was the IQ test invented?
To help kids in school. I think it was a British, he might have been
French.
Oh, it was French. Well, I know that one of the early applications was in the United Kingdom. But it was before it came to the United States and started being used, I think, for malevolent purposes. That might have happened in Britain as well. But it was really to, identify strengths and weaknesses and be able to individualize education better. Yeah.
And so the point is that's where, Alfred Binet, that was where the test was born.
Right.
And then it was hijacked by the eugenics movement. And this is like, Carol Dweck, who we also got to interview, all the growth mindset stuff, she describes her life work as undoing the mischief that Lewis Terman, who was the eugenicist who hijacked the IQ test, did when he moved it towards this measure of fixed potential. So, these tests have been misused. And they have been misused to be from something that is designed to find out where people are as a way to raise them up, to a way to separate them out and to essentially create an artificial aristocracy. And, I think that's shitty. Like, that's my honest feeling, is that it's shitty. And it's a shitty system. And, but the point is, why did we write the Straight A Conspiracy the way that we did? Is because what are you going to tell kids? Like, the system exists, and people believe in magic pieces of paper like a Harvard degree. Mm-hmm. And, you have to decide, what are you going to do in this system, right? To some extent, people are going to evaluate you based on grades, and they're going to evaluate you based on degrees. And ultimately, we want to change the system. But in the meantime, it may make sense to, it's not necessarily that, like you say, like the SAT can be used towards constructive ends. Like, if you really are using this as an opportunity to learn math, critical thinking skills, then great, right? So it's the spirit in which you're approaching it. But in the end, we just have to make sure that we're interpreting all of this information in the emotionally appropriate way. Right?
Exactly. I think just before we go too far beyond grades. So if grades were, let's just put aside my problems with the school environment and say that grades are a reliable feedback mechanism, which in some ways they certainly could be, then this is an opportunity for people to do something that school, through the milieu, generally discourages, which is confronting failure, confronting problems you haven't figured out how to solve yet. And the grade is a kind of not final grades on the report card, which is like, this is where I find out if I'm grounded or not type stuff. But you get graded every day in school. I remember what my attitudes were about grades once I started, fucking off by the time I got to high school and I decided other things were more important than school. But you're graded every day in school. And if that is an acceptable kind of feedback, there should be encouragement, and I don't think there is a lot of encouragement. And I don't think it's ever communicated like explicitly, but I think it's subtle, and I think it's consistent that this is a problem if you're failing, right? And you're kind of measured against what other kids are doing. So part of the impulse that develops, I think, for young people is to hide inadequacy and to not confront it, which actually comes back to bite you later in life.
Well, and crucially, that comes down to the feeling of stupid.
Right.
Because stupid is a feeling, and it's the feeling of shame, shame, shame. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the point is that, when you're ashamed of things, you hide them. And that's, they wad up those tests. They bury them in the back of their backpacks, and that's not the appropriate emotion to mistakes. And kids pick up that emotion absolutely from their environment, from their parents, from their schools. But the point is that mistakes are great, and they're how you improve the fastest. And you look at the cultures that embrace mistakes, like the FAA, plane crashes, people have died. Let's get all the wreckage out, guys. Let's listen to the black box flight recorder. Let's learn how we can improve the way we fly planes. And that's why mile for mile, you're safer flying than you are walking. And, Silicon Valley is a culture that, at least nominally, is about embracing mistakes and embracing failure. So the great thing is that, there is no reason why any human culture anywhere in the world at any age at this point should be hiding mistakes. We should all be getting our mistakes out in the open, embracing them, analyzing them, and seeing how we can use them to improve. And anyone who doesn't do that is being ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And, it should be treated as ridiculous that you're trying to give some other human shit for making a mistake, or that, you are feeling ashamed of your mistake. Everyone poops. We all screw up.
Right. And eventually you're going to be, the more you it's like with anything, the more you try to pack into the closet, sooner or later, it's all going to spill out anyway. I learned that when I started doing this show, my affect was, well, good news, I'm the smartest guy. So lucky you for listening. And then it was just a matter of a couple of years where it was clear that wasn't the case. Sorry, everybody. There were a bunch of other guys that didn't get factored in to the original claim. And, it was very humbling because I was really focused on, a lot of my experience, being new to libertarianism at the time, which comes with a huge amount of intellectual and moral superiority. That was the spot that I was in, like, mentally when I started doing the show. And it was through doing the show, learning through teaching after a couple of years when I realized how big the world of ideas actually was, where I just had to basically, come clean. And I'm just a guy on a journey learning along with you. But if you went back and listened to the show in like 2009, that was not the tone. So sooner or later, you are confronted with these things despite your best. I don't know if I was trying to hide the fact that I didn't know everything, that I didn't have all the answers, but it quickly became apparent to, thousands and thousands of people, which is, if you can confront that stuff before thousands of people are watching you, that's ideal, I found.
Well, but I think also it's helpful to have the thousands of
Sure.
people.
Oh, it was. Yeah.
You have huge amounts of social accountability. And the point is that, again, if you game out where is the internet going, more and more of us are just going to it's going to be revealed that none of these emperors have any clothes. And that, we all have huge holes in our mental game and that we don't necessarily know what we're talking about. And at a certain point, I think that's good, right? Like you use this closet analogy and, I dated an alcoholic, which is an experience that I think everybody should go through. Maybe it's not maybe the most pleasant at the time, but it's an amazing learning experience in terms of human psychology because alcoholics are amazing at rationalizing their behavior. They're literally the best at it. And you get to watch the human mind at work. And, they have this saying in AA that we're only as sick as our secrets. And, humanity has a lot of secrets right now. There are a lot of things that are being covered up. There's a lot of sort of trying to put on a public facade. And the point is, I think it's much better to just rip the Band-Aid out and get all that stuff out in the open. Let's hash it all out and let's talk out all of our differences and let's all be humiliated. I think humiliation is great. I can tell you my humiliation story if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear that. It reminds me, though, what you just said about being as sick as our secrets, which they do say in AA. I actually have been there, and I don't know if you say was an alcoholic, but I stopped drinking years ago because of problems with drinking. I mean, I think most people would slap that label to me if they saw how I behaved for, a good decade of my life. And I dated people during that time, so I can totally relate to what you're saying. But Nathaniel Branden, who wrote a lot on self-esteem and self-knowledge, he said that lots of times we tell ourselves it's okay to keep a deceptive secret because only I will know. But the truth is, that's all that matters, right?
Yeah.
What are you really thinking that you're hiding there if you're going to wind up being consumed by it, So yes, I agree that getting that stuff out in the open, which is very difficult to do. It's very, very hard to do.
Well, it's certainly difficult to do at first. I think that at a certain point, you get that positive feedback, right? Like in the sense that, you're like, oh man, I got this off my chest. I feel so much better now. And then, I'm sort of in the stage where I'm like, let's just get all the shit out in the open. Let's just let it fly. And, people will get pissed off and people will try and turn it against you.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Increasingly, I think that's the point is that ultimately, the idea of keeping secrets in the age of the internet is just incredibly ridiculous. And so I just think that, let's just accept that that's where it's going. Let's rip the Band-Aid off and let's just let open up the closet, get out all the junk. And, let's move on with it.
Okay. I don't have to put up screenshots of my internet search history, do I? There's some safe space I can have, right?
You do whatever you want, man. And listen, that's the point is that, the internet, I doubt that the internet will be very forgiving of that behavior.
Sure.
It certainly hasn't been to me when I tried to do it. But so, that's the nature of thing at a certain point. I have pretty strong faith that, that we're in a global conversation. That's happening. It's just going shittily. And the point is to make it go better. And to some extent, some people are going to need to be the first ones to sort of come out of the closet with their shit and to be open about this stuff. And I think that increasingly that's what people appreciate, the dumb game where you're trying to pretend that you have it all figured out or that you know all the answers or that, any of that is just, people I think are going to have less and less patience for that. And they're going to be more and more appreciative of, people who are I'm a human being. There are things I know and don't know. These are my feelings.
Mm-hmm.
I picked them up from my mom and dad. Where did you pick up your feelings from? And, you just get it all out in the open. So, I think it's great. I think that it's only going to get better. And I mean, my humiliation story was, I graduated, mine happened offline, right? But, I graduated, I did the things that my culture told me to do. I went to Harvard, I got the magic piece of paper, I graduated with a degree in biochemistry, and then, I moved out here. And literally I was so confused. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I hated the culture of science. I thought it was a shitty place. I couldn't define it. Like I had lots of feelings that I couldn't put a name to, but it was just not a good emotional climate, not a good social climate.
Sure.
And then, was like in an acting class surrounded by Scientologists who just talked about feelings all the time. And I was just convinced these people were total idiots. And then, at a certain point, I got so annoyed with them talking about emotions and feelings, and I couldn't make sense of what they were saying. I didn't respect what they were saying, and so I ran off to the science. And I was like, I'm going to read all the science on this, and then I'm going to know more about these people than that. Mm-hmm. And then I came to realize, oh, fuck, Scientologists are onto something. Oh, my God, these actors actually know what they're talking about. And that's when I started actually listening to Katie O'Brien, who had been banging on about the feelings of these children for ages, and, slowly started to wake up to the fact that she'd actually understood more about what was going on in these children's brains than I had. And then, really the sort of the point when I was really laid low was in 2010. I was visiting my family in Libya, and I was in the Sahara Desert, and I read John Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis. And then I was like, oh, fuck. Science, which I have worshipped, has just rediscovered what Jesus and the Buddha already knew, right? We rediscovered religion. Like, that fucking sucks. And so, all my certainty was stripped away, and then I was like, I have no fucking clue. And so I went and just sort of went back to square one and just started trying to figure out what the fuck did I really know.
So can we just unpack that a little bit more? What religion already knew?
Yeah. So take, for example, like, let's just, we'll go, here are a few really strong examples. So, the Buddhists, all the sort of Indian religions, the Buddhists, the Hindus, right? They talk a lot about this concept of Maya or illusion, right? Mm-hmm. And in science, that's called naive realism. And it's the degree to which people mistake their emotional experience of life for reality, right? So you're in you can experience Maya, if we go back to that argument, that hypothetical argument with a romantic interest, right? Where, when you're angry at someone, you're just totally convinced that they are the worst person in the world, right? And that feeling makes perfect sense. And that is the experience of naive realism. And then when you're in love with someone, suddenly you're like, they can do no wrong, they're perfect, right? So our emotions create these really, really strong experiences. When you start to unpack some of the things that Jesus said, you come to realize that he actually had understood many of these insights, right? So that's why the subtitle of John Haidt's book is Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom. Right. So, for example, take something like you have ears but do not hear, and you have eyes but do not see. Right? That's because that Maya or naive realism is so powerful that when somebody tries to tell you something that doesn't fit with your feelings, your mind just rejects it. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You've built a kind of reality tunnel that you move through. Sure.
And that's, by the way, why we called the book The Straight A Conspiracy, because we had a conversation with Stan Rogo, who was one of the executive producers on Lizzie McGuire, the Hillary Duff show. Yeah. And he was like, I'd done TV for kids for ages. And he was like, the one thing that I know is that teenagers' lives suck. They may not suck in any sort of objective sense. They may actually be quite cushy and quite comfortable. Right. And certainly they are, but emotionally they suck. And that's the big mistake that teachers try and make is they constantly try and tell them, you're great, you can do anything that you want. And that doesn't feel true.
Absolutely, right. Yeah. When so much about the environment says the opposite.
Right. So why did you call your thing the School Sucks Project? Because that feels emotionally true. And then you can get them in there, and then you can have a conversation. You can help them sort through those feelings. The same thing with the Straight A Conspiracy, where it was like, we had to get them to doubt their doubts. And that was how we were going to get them to believe in themselves. That all came out of that. But, that's what Jesus was talking about. The other thing of like you see the splinter in your brother's eye, but you do not see the log in your own.
Yep.
We're amazing at finding other people's faults and terrible at seeing our own. Again, especially when we're angry. And again, look at that romantic fight, right? Like we're so good at dialing in on what's wrong with the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the best, most life-changing insights that I've ever been given have come during a fight. Somebody was so angry and so pissed out off at me that they reached out for the most hurtful thing they could find. And that was the big log in my eye. And I was like, oh, shit, you nailed me there. You come to sort through that, and then you're like, oh, okay, they're right. Like, they have a point. And then, you begin the uncomfortable process of trying to tweezer that log out of your eye.
Those are totally really powerful. I don't want to call them the best learning experiences, like some kind of endorsement of like, hey, get out there and get in some really great fights with your loved ones because you'll learn a lot about yourself. But you do, because I have, from those very moments that you're describing, when you're finally confronted with the thing. Like I try to, I say, I don't need to argue today. I'm an adult. And, it's rude to your neighbor. But it's in those moments that you do learn a lot. And learning, I think it's I've learned to meter that, to communicate in, more clearly in real time. There was a book I read about this years ago that, people don't say what they're thinking, and they don't say what they're feeling. They let it build up, right? And it takes the form of this ball of resentment. And when it finally bursts out, a lot of people miss the opportunities to embrace the truth that was in there because it's so fucking nasty.
But it's great.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to endorse it. I think it's awesome.
But don't you think like letting it out gradually, it's uncomfortable at first to do that with people, because it creates these really like awkward moments like, oh, we were just having a good time and now I'm thinking about some flaw of mine. But I really, really have tried to do that and tried to be really welcoming when people do that to me, so it doesn't produce those resentment fireballs. Even though those resentment fireballs are life-changing experiences, like if you can just have a bunch of, firecrackers, that's fine, I think.
Well, I think if anything, I mean, for example, how do you approach the internet? Well, I get shit thrown at me all the time on the internet, right? And, especially because, I've taken to calling people out, and I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. And the point is that, again, the things that have been known for a long time, you don't have to go to religion. You can also go to Shakespeare, right? There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Right.
Right? So things are whatever they are, and then you wrap them in an emotional context. So everybody is focused on the idea that trolls are bad, right? I think trolls are great because trolls are my team of rivals. They come in and they just find the shittiest, most hateful things they can to say to me. But some of those things, if you approach it like Lincoln approached his team of rivals, you're like, there's great insight there, right? Haters gonna hate, and that's why I love them, right? They give me all sorts of great things. And then the question is, how do you use that, right? So the point is that, a lot of this is that you can use all of that material as teaching material, where when you suddenly, rather than there are these guys, I pissed off the New Atheists, and then they started sending me all these memes that were around, my nose. Right? And they think my nose is big. And so they Photoshop my nose to make it big. And then, they really ran with this. And then they put me next to a proboscis monkey.
These sound like new atheist arguments to me.
Yeah.
It's like par for the course. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's great because the proboscis monkey, with the Indonesians, their name for the proboscis monkey was the sunburnt Dutchman. And my dad's Dutch, and so I was like, do you guys realize how funny this is? This is so good. You're funnier than you realize. And when you start to do that, now what you start to do is now you've robbed them of a narrative, because if you take the joke on the chin, then nobody can be angry at you. And now you're just like, what's your point? Now we have to like actually get down to talking about the substance of the argument rather than just getting into this big superficial thing. And, and then they elaborated on that and they sent me a whole thing about tribal, right? So because I say the word tribe a lot because that's how humans behave.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they put the big exaggerated Photoshop nose with the word tribal. And I was like, great, thanks guys. This literally proves my point. Humans are tribal. I have threatened your tribe, and now you're throwing monkey shit at me
right.
to try and make me go away. So you just continue to keep proving my point. And that's, if you enter into that spirit of like, oh, this is great, you're doing me a favor, you're proving my point, you're my team of rivals, you're going to find the logs in my eye and help me refine and shape and improve my argument, then suddenly, you have a totally different experience of these people where it's like, oh, you're doing me a favor.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point is I rather than being mad at trolls, like use the resentment fireballs, right?
Sure. Do you always approach those kinds of situations so optimistically, or have you ever gone up against a group of people who were bothering you, let's say, and asked yourself, well, how much shit might I wind up eating here? And am I willing to eat it?
I think that's the thing. I mean, so much of it is that, most people never had the experience of being tutored by us, Brett.
Right, sure.
So most people just have a lot of feelings that they have never examined or confronted. And so, the point is that in practice, like, a lot of this behavior is cry for help behavior, right? They're like angry at you because you're threatening their worldview and they don't have a worldview that can make sense of or handle what you're doing.
Right.
And so if you engage them and are like, okay, like, I want to hear your story. What's your deal? Or I think that's so funny. Like, that's so great. And then you offer them a space and an opportunity to talk their ideas out and sort of, refine their ideas. Most of them have never been listened to, never been heard. And so once they have the opportunity to do that, then they move from being your enemy to being your ally.
Right.
And, they sort of like go away and then they come back and then they have conversations and then pretty soon, you come to understand, where the other person is coming from. You have a more robust sense. You see that, you're not taking yourself seriously. You can laugh at yourself. And then, ultimately that's how you're building and building and building the community, and you're refining your own thinking as well along the way.
Do you get that self-reflection or any self-reflection from them? And what I mean by that is you talk about kind of going up against the new atheists, right? So what I'm guessing happened, actually it's more than a guess. I think I remember you being on Rogan and you went after Dawkins and Sam Harris, right?
Yeah.
To a certain. So there's a lot of people who gravitate to people like that because they can get a sense of intellectual superiority just by being a follower of a person like that. I know that because libertarianism provides exactly the same thing. It has the answer to every political question, right? So when you knock down that pillar for them, it requires defense moves. Right? They have to protect what you're attacking because that kind of that person holds up a sort of intellectual framework that they find comfort in. And I don't know if you go back and forth with people like that. I mean, if you agree with me so far and you go back and forth with people like that, do they ever acknowledge that there's, maybe a little bit of idol worship going on there?
Well, I mean, I 100% agree with what you're saying.
Okay.
Right? This is about. It's about, the difference between, there's, because I also went up against the anarcho-capitalists and Tom Woods and, called out Peter Schiff and all of that. And
yeah.
So, and did Lena Dunham for social justice, and Richard B. Spencer, called Richard B. Spencer emo Kylo Ren. So, and then Richard B. Spencer, I love this. Then Richard B. Spencer, somebody said, you should go on their podcast. And he goes, I do go on non-human podcasts. And it's like, wow, way to be even more emo than I thought you were.
You were called non-human?
Yeah, non-human podcast. But yeah, what this comes down to is that, these people have never met their heroes. Right?
Sure.
And that's what it relies on. If you actually spent some time around these people, you would come to realize that, like, oh, wait, this is really about, your own insecurities. You're really trying to solve something. Oh, these are beliefs you picked up from your mom or dad. And the illusion would be shattered. And in fact, that's how awe is supposed to work in a tribal society, right? You're in awe of somebody who really is like a great hunter or a great cook, and then you sort of cozy up to them and you like start doing your hair the way they do and you walk the way they do, and you sort of work from the outside in, right? It starts superficial, and then it's an apprenticeship. You spend enough time with the person that you start to internalize their thinking and their experience. The problem is that in mass society, most of us never meet our heroes.
Right.
And so that illusion is never shattered.
Yeah.
And, I don't think I think that illusion is going to be shattered by the internet. I think that's the inevitable conclusion. But, what I'm focused on is because, a lot of this is what you're talking about is fundamentalism. And the appeal of sort of libertarianism, at least like the anarcho-capitalist version, is that there's a simplistic answer. The answer to everything is just get rid of government. And the same thing with new atheism. The answer is get rid of religion. Social justice. The answer is white men are the problem. That's the appeal of these things, is they offer very simplistic, easy answers, and then, have sort of do a bunch of verbal smoke and mirrors. And
they also provide a kind of Manichaean worldview of, black and white, good and evil, where if you identify the singular evil in the world and you oppose it, you are good.
That's right.
So
Islam versus the West.
Yeah.
Christianity versus secular society. So the point is that fundamentalism is not about religion. It's about a psychology. It's not about an ideology. It's about that righteous mind. And it's about a way of thinking that, as my dad's one of our friends says, in the Middle East, he says it takes 5 seconds to become a fundamentalist and a lifetime to become a Muslim. And that's the basic problem is that, most of these things, it takes 5 seconds to learn these fundamentalist ideologies, and it takes a lifetime to actually sort of achieve anything that even vaguely approximates wisdom.
Yeah, and it sucks when you start there, and I think I did. Like there were needs in me that I was trying to fulfill, right? So I graduated from college, and I was like a hardcore leftist socialist, and I had all the moral superiority in the world, and mediocre weapons to wield to demonstrate that intellectual superiority. Well, libertarianism seemed to be an easy transition because it had better weapons. And I used them. And then I got to this place where I was like, well, no, I do see the value in this political philosophy. There's a lot of value there that I think a lot of, other political ideologies could learn from. And I wish there was more discussion in education of people like, Lysander Spooner or Murray Rothbard or even Ayn Rand, people who all have flaws, but it like the fact that they're just excluded from the world of ideas in, secondary and higher education is really unfortunate. So there's a lot of value there, but I didn't come for the value. I came for emotional reasons. So then once my feet were firmly planted and sinking, I had to say, okay, well, I have to confront that. I have to confront how I got here. And then I have to say, what do I find valuable about this? Is there anything that's, some other place I should be that would be more valuable to me? Because a lot of these ideas, like a lot of this fundamentalism or fundamentalism by itself can be very, very toxic and very, very alienating and cause all kinds of problems for a person in their personal and emotional life, for sure. So, then it was just sort of a process of figuring out, like, okay, is this the right place for me to be? And if it is, why? And I don't think a lot of people get to do that with fundamentalism.
Well, and I mean, I'm sort of, you've helped clarify my own thinking here, because in the same way I came to science for emotional reasons, right? Like I came to science because it represented truth to me. Like I moved between all these cultures as a kid, didn't know how to make sense of the world. And then there was like this thing, science, right? That was like the answer to all of the problems. Right. And, that's the there's a thing that I love that Atul Gawande wrote about the mistrust of science. And he talks about how when he first got into science, he like went away to college, he learned some things, and then he came back and he was a little snot-nosed brat, and he lectured everybody about how they were wrong and they didn't know and blah, 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 blah. And he was like, which I'm sure my parents just loved. And then he grew up and he sort of moves from this litigious mind to this experimental mind, right? And that experimental mind is that evolution that you and I have both gone through, where you grow up and you start realizing that you don't know so much and that you are trying to figure things out and trying to learn from other people. And so I think that's the point, is to, where right now there are a lot of people who, young people, like that's sort of step one. Like, I don't think it's a problem necessarily that, as a young person, you gravitate towards whatever it is.
Right.
And then you're like, this is the answer to everything. Blah-da-da. But the problem is that, a lot of these young people who have gravitated towards these types of fundamentalism that's why the conversation is going so poorly. And whether, these sort of iconic figures, whether it's Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi with ISIS, or whether it's Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, or whether it's, Tom Woods and Peter Schiff, or whether it's any of these other people, and it's not that these people don't have a point, right? By the way, Joseph McCarthy had a point, right? It's not that Joseph McCarthy was totally wrong, right?
No,
There were attempts at communist infiltration in the United States. There was a threat of spying, but that he had lost all proportion, right? And that was the problem, is that it was a lack of proportion and decency. That, that he was spreading fear in the name of righteousness. And that's the basic problem, is that that's what happens. And
the Soviets would have loved that, by the way, if they had gotten to see it firsthand.
Well, and the point is that, how do you think Islam feels about the new atheists, right? If you're an Islamic fundamentalist, you love what the new atheists are doing, because the point is that you are driving that narrative that they thrive on, which is that, the West hates us. Right?
And that the great effort is necessary to continue to move the truth forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, because look at the enemies.
So all these fundamentalists feed off of each other, right? They're able to point to each other and be like, that's why we're doing it. That's why we have to close ranks. That's why, we really I need your money now. I need your support right now, because we're in this terrible time. So there's an unholy alliance that exists between fundamentalists. They all serve each other's storytelling. And the point is that, in practice, you find any one of these figures, and you find that there's a spectrum of people who listen to them, right? And so, if you engage with the new atheists, right, and you do something with Sam Harris, right, there are lots of people who listen to Sam Harris. And not everybody who listens to Sam Harris is, the ones who waste their time photoshopping my nose to be ginormous, right? A lot of people listen to him. They're sort of pretty realistic about, his faults and virtues. They appreciate the guests that he has on. They think he makes some good points sometimes, and then they're able to pick and choose, right? And that's the approach in which they listen to them. And you're going to find, by the way, that there are people who listen to Islamic fundamentalists who have a similar relationship, right?
Yeah, sure.
They appreciate some of the stuff they do, but they wouldn't necessarily listen to a lot of their more far out there ideas. But they may actually find some of their more far out there ideas kind of entertaining when viewed as entertainment, but not as a thing that a person should be acting on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can identify with a lot of things that I listen to for that very reason. There's like some agreement and some part where it like kind of turns to comedy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's the basic problem. But then there are people who are listening to those voices and are like, no, this is the truth. It must be acted on. Anyone who disagrees with us is a part of the problem, and they're a bad guy, and they need to be silenced, and they need to be whatever. And in the Middle East is poorer. There's much more violence. Governments don't work particularly well. And so a lot of this stuff is settled with violence.
Right.
They haven't gone through that better angels of our nature process completely, where they have functioning institutions and people resolve their differences through courts. On the other hand, here it's all meme wars because nominally our government hasn't broken down yet, but we'll see what's happening.
Right. Right. Well, it does show that there is a bit of a luxury here, right? That like people should, in their most critical moments, at least say that the reason why the space for these conversations exist is because there aren't marauders in the street. Not everywhere. In most places, there are not marauders. In some places, there are, but.
Brett, and this is the basic problem of your buddies like Peter Schiff and Tom Woods, and I don't know that they're all your buddies. And listen, none of this is to criticize any person.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But their ideas are problematic. And listen, having lived all over the world, Americans have won the passport lottery. You won.
Sure. Sure.
You didn't do anything for this passport, and you live in, the greatest labor market and the most stable country in the world. The point is that, Tom Woods, it's like all of these guys. I've had Tom Woods on the show, and I didn't call him out when he was on the show because we were trying to hear everybody out. And then we got all this feedback from all these young people who are like, Tom Woods housed you in that debate. And we were like, yeah. We weren't aware that we were in a debate. We were just trying to let the guy say his piece, right? But for Brian and I, having grown up all over the world, we were like, I don't know, a lot of this doesn't make sense. Like, we've seen how the rest of the world operates. And, you think that you're going to remove the government and have private militias, and you don't think that this is going to turn into a civil war? Like, this isn't just going to turn into The Walking Dead?
See, I don't know who thinks that, though. Like, that seems like a caricature to me, or at least based on the circles that I'm in. Like, I'd be surprised, Tom and I have had several conversations. I'd be surprised if he thinks, or if he talks about, a plan like that. I don't know what kind of interactions you've had, but share as much as you'd like, and I can respond to it. I'm interested.
Well, I think part of what I've learned from talking to various people on Twitter and in general is that much of the libertarian argument is that you don't like the government's use of force.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm going to tell you that the point of government is that it uses force.
I agree.
So what is treated as, I think that's the core fundamental. In terms of that Shakespearean idea of there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that any of these things are bad. I don't think that any of these things are good. I think that they're tools, and I think you have to figure out what is the appropriate use of the tool. And so the point is that if you look at the evolution of societies, and I would recommend to anybody Fukuyama's books on this, in particular The Origins of Political Order, that, you have band level societies, they fight, they kill each other. And then this Leviathan comes in, which is the monopoly on legitimate violence. And what that does is it solves a problem. It solves this band level genocide. But then it creates another problem, which is that the Leviathan has all this power and isn't accountable. So now you have this evolution towards societies where you have rule of law, where now the Leviathan has to obey the law, right? The Glorious Revolution of 1660 in the United Kingdom, which then sets up the American Revolution in 1776.
Sure.
So what you're doing is that you're constantly figuring out how to have larger and larger societies with better and better mechanisms of accountability. And I think the Founding Fathers understood this very well. And, Madison in Federalist, I can't remember what the number is, but, he says, if men were angels, then no governments would be necessary. But because men aren't angels, governments must be set up over them. But then the problem is that you need men to run those governments, and then those men aren't angels. And so ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And that's the point, is that's what checks and balances are about. is that it doesn't matter who the human being is who is in whatever role they're in, whether it's in a company as a CEO or as the president of the United States within government, that much power is going to fuck with their psychology. It's going to corrupt.
Absolutely.
And every human being needs to be held accountable. But the basic problem with a lot of the sort of libertarian arguments is that it assumes that the internal accountability mechanisms of the market are sufficient, and that you don't need the external accountability of a group of people with totally different incentives in the government. So if you look at, for example, what happened with big tobacco, they colluded, they worked together. And that's because while they may have been trying to beat the other tobacco companies, they had a shared interest to keep the public smoking. And,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the point is that's why you need government to check that. And that's why you need institutions like the FDA. But the problem is that again, like per Peter Schiff's camel story, does the government metastasize? Of course it metastasizes. Every institution tries to metastasize. And the challenge is to make sure that all the checks and balances are working so that everything is being kept. It's like whack-a-mole. You have to, and the problem is I think that the basic part of the whack-a-mole that is broken down is the people. I don't think the people are well enough informed to be able and engaged enough to be able to hold their institutions accountable. And everything may need to be trimmed back. We'll have to see what those roles and those proper functioning is. But I think that if we were to really get down to Tom Woods and Peter Schiff's feelings, that I think that a lot of that they sort of think, and that was what became clear to me in that interview with Peter Schiff, is, and somebody tweeted me about this afterwards. Peter Schiff's dad was jailed for tax evasion, and he died in prison.
Absolutely.
And I can emotionally understand 100% why Peter Schiff hates the government. But hate blinds, and it means that you can't see things clearly. And so he wants to literally throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, I wouldn't sum up Peter Schiff's worldview. And I'm not saying that you're doing this, just in case anybody is just kind of listening right now. I wouldn't want to sum up Peter Schiff's worldview as one entirely created by the fact that his father was jailed for disobeying the IRS, right? Like, Peter Schiff has studied the Austrian school. He's very concerned about the devaluation of the dollar. Like, there are reasons why Peter Schiff believes the things that he does, and he might have learned some of that from his father, Erwin Schiff. But what I heard you talking about for the last few minutes is a kind of evolution, of the state. And you mentioned checks and balance, and I agree with that. But I think the most important check is the fourth estate, which you and I are now a part of. Even if Anderson Cooper and Chris Matthews might not like that we're a part of it. The media. So I think that having this conversation about libertarian ideas is very, very important. And I think they need to be subjected to as much criticism as people can dish out. But one of the things that we've encountered, over the last decade, since the sort of Ron Paul revolution, is that there's a suspicion we have about why we're being excluded from the conversation. And, everybody thinks like, oh, we're being excluded from the conversation because we have the truth and nobody wants the truth. I don't think anybody else really takes these ideas seriously. But just to go back to the evolution, and I'll tie the two together, it seems like if you go back to the earliest forms of government, let's say Egypt, the story was, hey, everybody, I'm a god. So you better do what I say or we'll kill you. And then there was kind of like, as time went on, there were checks like that were based on reason and curiosity, where people said, no, I'm not buying it anymore. Maybe it took generations. So it went from we're gods to we talk to God to we do the will of God. And people just kept saying, over time, and this is a very simplified story, bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. Okay, we don't do the will of God. We do the will of, what could we do the will of? The people. We do the will of the people. And now we've seen in the last half century, even that idea has broken down. Most people don't believe that anymore about politics. And then if you look at things like the 2008 financial crisis, where, people were getting 9-to-1 letters, from their constituents in Congress, 9-to-1 against these too big to fail bailouts, and they voted for it anyway. The Iraq War. I think as information spreads and people have more access to the interworkings of government, they're rejecting that idea more and more. So what I'm saying is that I don't think government is a destiny. I think it is part of the human evolution. I think it needed to exist. And I think that if somebody put a button in front of me and said, push this and it will be gone tomorrow, I wouldn't push it. I don't want that much blood on my hands. But I think that the conversation has to continue so that evolution can continue. I don't think that I'll die in a fundamentally different world from the one that I live in today. I want to believe, right? So now we're getting into feelings. I want to believe that one day human beings could live without, the initiation of force, which is one of the most dangerous relationships. And I think the 20th century demonstrated this, that if some people have this right or whatever you want, privilege to initiate force on other people, like that never ends well. It always, like the backup plan is always, I could just kill you. So I want to keep that evolution going, and I think that's what that conversation is. I don't think there are too many libertarians who are saying, I want to, I mean, maybe there are. I don't know who you're talking to, but those ideas of like ending the state tomorrow, that's not appealing to me. That's not why maybe I was into that in the beginning, but yeah. I'm much more grounded in the world that I actually live in today.
You know what's hilarious about all of this, Brett? This is literally the same narrative that the communists came up with.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. The evolution to the utopia.
Yeah. And the point is that capitalism was a necessary stage. And, originally, the hope was for an overnight revolution, a global communist revolution. But then, over time, when that wasn't happening, it softened and it said, that, it will progress and it will happen in time. So this is the human brain doing narratives and creating narratives that make sense of the world. But let's, I think what would be really helpful here is, can we agree that Peter Schiff is a human being?
Yeah, totally.
Can we agree that Thomas Woods is a human being?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, in the same way, see, that's the thing. I think in terms of the evolution of the state, I think that, you can look at the last 250 years, but I think you have to take the really long view and go back to the ancient Egyptians like you were doing. Mm-hmm. And the ancient Egyptians, created this view of, that this perfectly ordinary man named Ramses II was a god, right? And they did it with smoke and mirrors, and they did it with creating a certain persona and a certain amount of bedazzlement. And, this is what all of these fundamentalist figures rest on. They rest on a certain intellectual bedazzlement, where they, Peter Schiff knows this Austrian school of economics. Sam Harris has, all of these books and, blah, 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 blah. If you go and you look at the Muslim fundamentalists, they have an encyclopedic knowledge of the Quran. They know it better than anyone, right? They can pull this stuff out anytime they want, and they can do these amazing rhetorical flourishes that justify their behavior. Mm-hmm. Very, very good at it, and that's the problem is that they're so good at it that they can do that. And academics, my own tribe, right, are amazing at that. And crucially, this is where we come into my favorite story that I wanted to tell you, which is the story of the invisible hand wave. So, there's been this revolution in economics, and it's been this revolution of, behavioral economics, where, there's this assumption in sort of what's usually called classical economics that of rational agent theory, right? That humans behave as rational agents. Mm-hmm. And because of people like Kahneman and Tversky, that work from Kahneman and Tversky, which was in psychology, that is the basis of thinking fast and slow, diffused into economics. And a group of people like Richard Thaler took that and started to, say, hey, based on what we actually know about how human beings behaving, this rational agent theory is a bad assumption. It's a terrible assumption. And
today I would agree with you. I wouldn't, at one time, I would have said, nope, that's not true. That's just a scare story to justify the existence of things like religion and government. But I've observed enough of the world to basically have serious skepticism about the rational agent.
Yep. And this is going to be so much fun. I'm so excited for this. So, Richard Thaler tells a story, and it's a story about him being at a dinner party.
Mm-hmm.
And he's at a dinner party with, a bunch of like academics at the University of Chicago. So, by the lights of our society, brilliant guys,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's this famous classical economist, and there's, this psychologist. And the classical economist is talking about what idiots human beings are, right? And he's saying, my wife is such a dumb bitch. This dumb bitch, she just bought a new car and she won't take it out of the garage.
Yep.
Doesn't she understand sunk cost fallacy? Like, how dumb is this?
I see where this is going. Yep.
Right.
Right.
And then
right.
he says, my students, even my graduate students, they're such fucking idiots. They can't understand the most basic economic concepts. He goes on and on and on like this. And at a certain point, the psychologist says, how come all the people in your models are geniuses, but all the people you know in the real world are total idiots?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when this guy proceeds to go, and he starts to wave his hands, and he starts to talk about how the efficient market hypothesis and the market always works it out in the end, and blah, 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 blah. And Richard Thaler branded this the invisible hand wave.
Yeah.
So you brought the guy's beliefs into conflict with his own evidence. And what did he do? He rationalized, because it would be so uncomfortable to admit that his founding assumption of all of his work was a bad assumption, and that intellectual house of cards would come tumbling down. And that's totally understandable. I can understand that a human being would want to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the basic problem is that when you then we start to look at, and this is where we get back to what I actually sent Peter Schiff. There's a great book by Russ Roberts, who's a Stanford economist, called How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. And at the beginning of the book, Russ Roberts, who's been an economist for 40 years, says, Adam Smith wrote 2 books, right? Adam Smith had the same job as us, Brett. He was a tutor. Mm-hmm. That was how he paid his bills. And he wrote 2 books, and one of them was The Wealth of Nations, which is the founding text of capitalism, and the other one is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, right? Which is a book all about how human beings actually think. And he said, Russ Roberts says, it's embarrassing to admit that I had never read Adam Smith's other book, and I don't think most economists have. And when you do, you realize that Adam Smith is saying what he means by capitalism is this very behavioral economics worldview, right? And those are the sorts of things that he's interested in. And it wasn't at all what I'd thought. And so what you realize is that what behavioral economics is doing is it's reinventing the wheel. And that is, in general, what is happening now. In all these academic disciplines, what is John Haidt's happiness hypothesis about? It's reinventing the wheel of how we understand the human brain to work in the way that the Buddha understood, and in the way that Jesus understood, and Ben Franklin understood, and all of that. And so we're returning to very old assumptions. And I think that when you look at 1776 and what the intellectual climate of 1776 was, it was a growth mindset. Because there's a great quote in David McCulloch's book, 1776, that says it was a day and age that believed that a man by serious and diligent application to books could teach himself whatever was required. And what happened was the eugenics movement destroyed that basic faith in human potential, and that the key to fixing America and to getting it to work properly is to bring that faith back. And that's what the job of the Fourth Estate is, and that's what our job is, because I don't think that Anderson Cooper is going to be doing it.
Agree.
And I think that when you find that, when you restore that faith, what you're going to find is that the government is going to need to be trimmed back, and that corporations will be held accountable, and that what you're going to find is that it's going to be a restoration of those checks and balances. And I think that it will look like I think it's in general, I personally don't have any big faith in those sort of communist narratives of that these institutions are going to disappear. I think they're just going to be made more and more accountable.
What about that kind of social evolution narrative that you are correct is definitely a part of the Marxist dialectic?
Well, I think there's a dialectic. I think the Marxists are right, absolutely. There's a dialectic between cultures, between nations, between ideas, and that there is a social evolution that is happening. I mean, I want to facilitate that social evolution and make it happen faster. And for example, in an environment where constantly people are being disrupted out of a job by new technologies, I think you probably need UBI. I think you need universal basic income. And crucially, you need to have totally new intuitions around work. And you need to move from motivation 2.0, where we're doing things because we're getting paid, to motivation 3.0, where we're driven by autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how can I be more useful. Now, in practice, the actual real world experience of Brett is that Brett has done this podcast and he's just tried to serve his community, and people have appreciated that. And I guarantee you there has been reciprocal altruism in finding ways to support you financially.
Yeah, sure.
So that economy works, an economy where it's a service economy and where we're all trying to serve each other, and we compete by who can provide the most value, and then we are rewarded with money. And the problem is that, if you look at the welfare state and you look at all of those problems, right, in practice, you're going to find that much of that laziness comes down to people not understanding their potential. They have a fixed mindset about their intelligence, or, they have old intuitions around work, which don't necessarily make sense, or they don't like learning. And that, you have to debug that cultural software, and, because people have to work. They have to work because if I don't work, I don't feel good about myself. I don't have dignity. So,
well, wait a minute. Where do you think that idea comes from? Do you think that's innate, or do you think that's imposed?
It's innate.
Really?
No, I think that's innate. I think so there's a great book. So here's a little historical story that I also love. So are you familiar with the expression Arbeit macht frei?
No.
So Arbeit macht frei is famous because it was what the Nazis put on the gates of Auschwitz. And it means work will set you free.
Okay.
And so it became this sick, twisted thing in the context of Auschwitz. But it originally comes from a novel, and it's a novel about a guy who is a young German guy who is a dissolute gambler and, an alcoholic and all of those things. And he finds salvation through work. It's having some sort of sense of purpose, some sort of sense of challenge that gets him on a better path.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think that's the nature of human biology, and I think we can track that. We need autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and we need to be challenged in order to be happy. Like, if you win the lottery and you just sit on the couch all day, you're going to get depressed. Like, that's what's going to happen.
Okay, so you think if a person is living in a way that isn't consistent with that, they're in some form of denial.
Well, I just think that, track the results. Why does Bill Gates still work?
Right. Oh, no, I agree. I mean, I'm kind of observing a lot of my surroundings and saying, I wonder if people have found a workaround for this, right? If it's innate, because, you see a lot of people doing nothing, and I'm wondering, it's not a question I've really ever asked, most of them, how are you feeling about this? It's interesting.
Well, you should.
Yeah.
You should ask how they're feeling, and I think you might find some interesting feelings there that haven't really been exposed or that aren't necessarily obvious. But it's also, what are the social cues that people are getting, right? So, and this comes down to, for example, things like music, right? What messages does rap music say about what makes you awesome in life? Well, it depends on the rap music, but
right.
Some of the rap music certainly suggests that life is about, there's like old school rap, which is one thing. And then, there's some rap that's just sort of about like pussy, pussy, booty, booty, I'm not going to even try and, go down this road. But there is some rap that doesn't necessarily send the most positive social messages. Right. And in the same way, academia, we can look at that culture, right? That the positive thing is to act more superior, more condescending, to sort of show off your intellect. And that those are the behaviors that are rewarded. So a lot of this then comes down to culture and the sort of messages that are being sent and what behavior is being rewarded in different cultures. But the social evolution is that I think that you ultimately, where, if you game out, where does the internet take us, right? It's that essentially we keep on, doing, I think you called it, what was it? Something fireballs?
Resentment fireballs.
Yeah. All the resentment fireballs are going to fly, and they're going to burn the logs out of everybody's eyes. And, you start to do more and more of that shit, then we will sort each other out, and it will start to really work like a global village. I think that's where this all games out to.
So we built a lot of groundwork there to get to my final question from this about the straight A conspiracy. Do you think that the public school system, as it currently stands, is fixable, reformable?
I think it is, but I think it's not, I think regardless, as I said, you have to educate. Firstly, there's a couple of things. One, even to reform the public school system, you have to educate the public, right? So that's that. But also, secondly, I think that the very idea of school is problematic. And
agree, yeah.
Because the point is that, the experience of the 21st century and constant innovation and technological disruption is, and this goes back to that Alvin Toffler quote that I referenced, right? Toffler, who's a futurist, said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn.
Right.
And so the point is that we will all constantly be in school for the rest of our lives. We will all constantly be having to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And then the question is, what is the experience of young people, right? Like, how are you onboarding new humans into this system? How are you helping them get up the curve so that they can take advantage of the internet and take advantage of all these resources to teach themselves? And, I think that's the point. I don't think, it depends on what you mean by the current system. Do I think that the system as it exists now? No, I think the system will have to evolve in response to all those new tools in that new environment. But I think there'll be some sort of onboarding experience, I don't know whether it happens. Maybe, we don't, because a lot of this relies on economics, right? Like, why are you concentrating people in one place? Well, you're concentrating people in one place because economically that made sense, and teachers had to be physically co-located with you. And in the age of the internet, that doesn't have to be true. So, maybe kids are just sort of living at home, and then, there's all these great resources online. I don't know. I mean, the great thing about evolution is I don't fully know what system is going to emerge.
Okay, so evolution, there's a lot to explore there in schooling right now, or I would say even, schooling versus education. And a huge part of that calculation has to be the institutional resistance. Why are schools still where they are in 2017, which is an industrial model that's now 150 years old? Right. And I don't know. I mean, I assume that you've studied the history of the system, right? The public system in America and other Western countries.
Yeah. But Brett, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
You're a capitalist, right?
I don't really like that word. It doesn't really mean anything anymore. Capitalism has a lot of shit wrapped up in it now. Like if people are saying that America is a capitalist country, then the word capitalism doesn't mean anything anymore. I'm for free markets.
Yeah, you believe in the free market.
Yeah.
I believe in the free market. So, the point is that, think about the insanity of so much of the marketplace of ideas. People are still grounded in this assumptions of like, oh, we need to reform the existing system. No, we need to outcompete it.
Exactly. That's the idea that I was getting to with the market demand for government. That's what people have right now. So until you offer them something better, libertarians, then that's what you're stuck with. And I think that school is for almost all parents in the world, even the ones who are in the country who complain about school and hate Bobby's fourth grade teacher or Sandra's principal, school is a problem solved. Your kids are kept somewhere 35 hours a week while you go to work. And, they get report cards that have the names of academic subjects on them so you can assume they're learning something while they're there. So that is like the government fills, or the public system fills that demand for people currently. And it kind of goes to what you were saying about educating the public, right? Because a lot of people don't even want to confront the problems with that system right now.
Yeah, and the point is that, I mean, again, you have to work within the political realities, right? Like a lot of people are going to send their kids to school, and part of it is free babysitting,
Yeah.
right? Like you're saying. But the point is that, and the point of the Straight A Conspiracy and, all the things that, the School Sucks Project has been doing is that we can improve that experience. If you're going to be sending them to get babysat, at least have them get more out of the babysitting experience and have it so that that experience builds their confidence in their intelligence rather than destroying it.
Which requires them to take control of it, right? It requires them not being passive. I mean, one of the things, ideally, I talk about people teaching themselves and families educating, their children outside, or letting their children educate themselves outside of schools. Now, that's not for everybody. That's for my audience. But the other part of the show that I have to deal with is school survival, and I think that's a really important theme in a Straight A Conspiracy. I mean, that's pretty much the message of the book, right? Because if you're going to go to school, you have to survive it and come out on the other side successful. The sucks in school sucks, aside from, hearing that from students 1,000 times over a decade, was also, I think that young people go into those buildings with a lot of attributes that sort of point them towards success already in place, right? They're curious, they're creative, they don't know much, but they believe in themselves based on what they do know. They're energetic, they're motivated and curious. I mean, that is the best teacher right there. But on the other end of that 15,000 hours, not so much with any of those attributes. And I observed this. When I named the show, I was tutoring kids who were 16, 17, and 18 years old and observing their general attitude towards life. And I understand being a teenager is a part of that. And I was contrasting that to my nieces and nephews who were getting ready to go into school at age 4 and 5. And the as far as like being set up for like self-directed success, all the points went to the 4 and 5-year-olds.
The humans naturally love to learn.
Yeah.
The chemical is dopamine. The point is that they get acculturated by school, and there's an evolutionary process that happens in school that moves them to a place of hating learning. It disempowers them.
Yep.
It destroys their intelligence. It's not true for every kid, but it's true for a heck of a lot of kids. And that's why in the emotions chapter, we literally parodied the evolution diagram of the famous one of you have like the evolution of the ape to the man, right? Mm-hmm. And so we did that, and we literally have like a small kid who's curious and excited, and then they start to get nervous and insecure, and then they become afraid of making mistakes, and then suddenly they have all this like anxiety, and then eventually they're like, whatever, I don't like learning. And that's the evolutionary process that a lot of people go through in school, and that's what happens. It fucks people up. But I think, that part of that is, I think that the challenge is, again, like you're probably going to go to school. Like the majority of Americans, the majority of people in the developed world are going to go to school. And I think the key thing is that not everybody has that experience. And that comes down to culture. And the core thing is faith in human potential. And how do you react to mistakes? And do you embrace and analyze mistakes and use them to improve, or do you take them as a personal reflection of your self-worth? And, I think that's the point is that, that's why we did the Straight A Conspiracy, is because people, a lot of those eugenic ideas are still floating around in our culture. And Carol Dweck has spent 40 years trying to unseat them. And, I think there are faster ways to unseat them, which is for science to just issue an apology and just say, we're sorry. We screwed up the culture of America, and it's time we made that right. But the academic institutions are not likely to do that. No. So I'm going to do it, and I'm sorry.
Well, you talk about faith in human potential. I mean, I almost, at this point, looking at the history of the system over more than a century, it's almost the embodiment of the lack of faith in human potential. And you look at these phases that it went through, starting with, the Horace Manns and the Victor Cousins going over and sort of looking at the Prussian model of education. And this is, you want to talk school conspiracies. There are many, but when you understand the motivations at every different phase, I think school had these 4 historical phases. The first was homogenation. The second one was socialization. The third was scientific management. And the most recent one is kind of a globalization. But if you understand the motivations at each phase, these characters who were driving these projects, they're not as nefarious as they appear to be at first. They were interested in the Prussian model, even though it was driving a militaristic society. They said, hey, that's a competitor, so let's go see what they do. And they went and they liked it, so they brought it here. And then, a couple decades later, John Dewey took over and said, we could use this to build a kind of social utopia. And, then the eugenicists took over, led by the Rockefeller Foundation in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. They passed it off, an easy pass off to the behaviorists in the 50s and the 60s. And then the sort of globalists, the global citizen idea, took off in the 80s and the 90s. So the schools have always had an agenda that wasn't the individual. There always was a kind of scientific management. There was always a kind of human zookeeping. And I don't think that's a place where, the faith, any faith in human potential is ever going to be appreciated or realized. So I've said, I don't expect the schools to change. When I started this podcast in 2009, I said, this is not a show about school politics. Nothing bores me more. I've never been to a PTA meeting. I don't care what those people do. I'm not talking to those people, and I have no political solutions to this problem. If you are interested in education, here's how you can move beyond the schools.
But this is the political solution. The political solution is that when, so I like to say that there's a reason why the Second Amendment is second. It's because it's plan B. If we fail with being informed and being educated, then it gets into a shooting war, right? And you have to deal with that. But so, plan A, right? So the same way as a well-regulated militia being necessary to the defense of a free state, a well-educated public is necessary to the defense of a free state. So if, if you have 100 million Americans who really know how to teach themselves whatever is required, return to the attitudes of 1776. They not only have that faith in their potential, but they have all these great skills, the sort of meta skills of how to teach yourself. Well, then those 100 million Americans know what's wrong with the school system. And now they have the sort of numbers and the sort of clarity necessary to put the social pressure on to actually change and reform the system to whatever the system should be, right, for the 21st century. But you first have to create that, large group of individuals who really know what they're talking about and have some clarity. And the problem is that academics don't want clarity. They want to do the invisible hand wave because that maintains their power as gurus. And the point is that we need to get to the de-gurification where we just start talking brass tacks and we get back to that sort of clarity in order to put that social pressure on. And I think you said something really important, which is that, a lot of this was not malicious. And one of the things that we talk about a lot, at least I talk about, there are a lot of things that I talk about a lot. I drone on about them. But one of the things that I talk a lot about, which I think is super useful, is Hanlon's razor. So Occam's razor is all things being equal, the simplest explanation is the truth. Hanlon's razor is never attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity.
I don't know. That's kind of a dicey one when it comes to government. Because
when it comes to your feelings about government, Brett,
I don't know. I mean, let's separate. Like the DMV is government, and so is the CIA, right? And there's probably two different levels of competence going on in each place.
So let's take a look at the educational system, since that's the area.
Sure.
You know best, I know best, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of it is that, listen, they look at the behaviorists, right? why does behaviorism evolve, right? Behaviorism evolves because you got a bunch of scientists who are massively uncomfortable with their emotions. They really bought into this sort of rationalist idea, and they want a nice, tidy model of how humans work.
They wanted quantification. Yeah.
That's right, because they worship math as a god. And so what they do is that they create this belief system that sort of satisfies all their emotional trigger points, and then they convince themselves of it. They really think they've got it figured out, and then they're like, "Great, we should apply this in the real world."
It's funny,
right?
They do it without hardly talking to humans.
Of course, but that's
find me some birds and some rats, and we'll figure things out. Right.
Well, that's the problem with the ivory tower. Right?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
They're isolated from any other cultures, and so and this is, they call the culture of academia weird. That's actually what they call themselves: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And they are weird, and they come up with these weird models, and then they apply them. And some of the here's another. Do you know about Hermann Ebbinghaus?
No, I've never heard that name.
It's another great one. You'll love this, right? In terms of the whole school sucks thing. So Hermann Ebbinghaus was this German psychologist who decides that he wants to study the brain, right? And for a scientist, the brain is a really problematic thing because it exists inside this box called the skull. You're not allowed to open the box. They tell you that's morally not okay. So,
Right.
So how are you going to understand what's in this box? And, so he decides, I'm going to study something really simple, memory. But then he realizes, memory is really problematic, because he's like, why do I remember things? Well, I remember things when they make sense. And then I also remember things when they're super emotional, right? Everybody remembers where they were on 9/11. And if you were alive, then you remember where you were when you found out JFK had been shot, right? Strong emotions lock these memories in place. So he's like, that's really a problem, because how do I quantify or control emotions, right? And so what Ebbinghaus does is he designs this experiment. And the experiment is this. You're going to love this so much. I love it. So he comes up with nonsense words, and he puts them on flashcards, and he says them in the most emotionless voice that he can manage, the most boring, monotonous voice that he can, so that no emotion creeps in. And he just repeats them on flashcards again and again and again. And he studies how quickly he memorizes these words, and then how quickly he forgets them. And he comes up with all these things, and he finds out that, yes, repetition does create learning. And then what happens is that people are like, oh my God, this guy has figured out human memory. He's figured out how learning works. And so Ebbinghaus's assumptions about memory and learning are baked into the school system. Those assumptions have become a core part of it. And there's lots of flashcards, there's lots of drill and kill, and it all comes from people like Ebbinghaus.
When did he work?
In the 1900s, so 100 years ago. And the problem is that, what the experimental design was, that he excluded logic, right? Things that make sense, that have meaning. And then he excluded emotion, so the things that make things memorable.
Right.
And that's our school system. But it's all based on a bad assumption where somebody forgot why the experiment was designed that way 100 years ago. And, in practice, that's why, we have that chapter in the Straight A Conspiracy, navigate your test prep like a London cabbie, because, repetition is the fourth most powerful memory technique. It's the least effective memory technique, but it is the one that most students are relying on. And they should be using meaning or logic, right? And they should be using emotion, right? Oh, wow, that creates a strong emotion. And crucially, they should be using story. Because story is a super technique that incorporates things being linked together in a meaningful sequence and having strong emotion around them. But, if you look at history, like a lot of kids approach history as drill and kill. They approach it like Ebbinghaus, a lot of facts to be drilled. But you can also unpick and sort of connect the emotional story of what those human beings were doing. And you'll find that really sticky and really memorable. But the problem is not the textbook necessarily even, although many of them are very boring. The major problem is the assumptions you're bringing about how your own brain works.
Sure, absolutely. And just to add to the Ebbinghaus, because I think that was introduced through Hamlin's razor, right?
Yeah.
Because that today it's like ha 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 phrenology, weren't these people ridiculous? And I think that's fair, but let's remember too, and why I kind of balked at not just assuming incompetence instead of malevolence, even though yeah, malevolence is kind of subjective here because I think that the people who do these things that wind up treating people like cattle, they think they're doing the right thing. I think that's part of the insularity of academia is that ordinary people, the masses, are terrifying, and setting up ways to control them, even if it's kind of an affront to someone's humanity, is the ends justify the means. I think in a lot of their minds, but Ebbinghaus to me sounds like one of these early behaviorists, right? Like, I mean, that if he's stripping out emotion and, just trying to work scientifically and quantitatively.
I mean, strictly behaviorism starts with Skinner, right? But science gets shittier from 1776 on, right?
Okay.
There's progress, right? We sort of get Darwin, we get all of that. It's very, but at a certain point, what happens is that there is this desire to quantify everything and to have it be super measurable and super controllable.
Right.
And that's when you start to get this shitty science that ultimately behaviorism is really science's low point, right? That's the worst of the worst.
It is like the postmodernist's best argument, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So
that's where science hits rock bottom, and then there's been this process of sort of working its way out of that rock bottom to reinvent the wheel and to complete this process of coming back to much of what was already known by earlier cultures, and now we know it more clearly and we know it more powerfully. The wheel is better. Yeah. But a lot of it is these very old ideas.
So the contrast that I wanted to make with Ebbinghaus is that I don't want anyone to walk away thinking that the school has these remnants or the schools are the way. I'm not saying that you were making this argument, but the schools are the way they are because of some foolish phrenology-like thing from 100 years ago. Throughout the 1960s, I mean, behaviorism was fully formed and mature. And because of its scientific and quantitative appeal, it was very, very powerful. And it was being applied to the schools, full force through government agencies, think tanks, corporate interests, and private foundations. And these papers were coming out of academia. I don't have the one I know was called the Behavioral Science Teacher Education Project. I think one was called Designing Education for the Future. And this was about turning the schools into a kind of laboratory where psychological experimentation could take place and scientific management could be perfected. So I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but I just want to add that to the story that people have understood, even back to the Woodrow Wilson days, that quote we read hours ago. The schools were understood to be basically a branch of industry and a tool of governance. They had nothing to do with individuals learning. They would learn something. They would learn what they needed to learn to be fit to their proper role in society. But it was nothing more than that. And that's just one of the things that I want to stress. It's
a bad analogy, right? Like fine, factory. You're going to have a factory and it's going to pump out widgets.
Right.
That's the bad analogy for education. Right? Humans aren't widgets. They have emotions. They have feelings. They learn socially. We now know that humanity's superpower is that it has high social intelligence. That's what all the data says. There's this graph that, we're now heading towards the third hour. So, this is Rogan-esque. I love it.
Yeah.
So if you give a chimp, an orangutan, and a human toddler an IQ test, what you'll find is that we have humans have lower causal intelligence, so a worse ability to figure out why as toddlers than a chimp. We have lower spatial intelligence, and I think we have lower quantitative intelligence. But on social intelligence, we're off the charts. And That's how humans learn. That's when you're talking about your nieces and nephews, right? They're alive, right? They're really watching and looking and learning from the environment.
Yeah, learning is synonymous with living at that point.
That's right. And the point is that that's how we should be teaching, right? is that you have to begin from the right assumptions. And the right assumptions is that humans are socially intelligent. And the problem is that when you ignore that social intelligence, which academics have done for a very long time, then what ends up happening is that you are sending social cues without even realizing it. So you're sending these cues that like, oh, if you don't get a good grade, then you're an idiot and you're no good and we're going to throw you away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, oh, math is scary and oh, Shakespeare is hard. And you're sending out all these social cues that are screwing people up, and you're throwing off all that information, but you don't value that information because it can't be turned into a number easily. And so therefore you think that information doesn't exist, but it exists. It's just not easily quantified. And that's the basic problem, is that, I think we have to, for me, part of this is that we have to stop referring to all of that stuff as science. Because science is a very specific thing. The scientific principle, where it starts from this very simple idea that you should change your mind in light of evidence. And, there's evidence about how the current way of structuring the school system is working. It's not. The evidence is clear.
Oh, yeah.
You should respond to that evidence, and you should change shit, right? Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. It would be insane for us to continue to do what we're doing. We should be like, holy shit, wake up and change our behavior. But in practice, what is going to happen, that's probably not going to happen. It's probably, Brett, I'd like to believe that humanity listens to this podcast and they're like, shit, you know what? Brett and Hunter are right.
Yeah, well, there is no we in school. We're not the ones, like, we can say, yeah, man, doing the same thing over and over again is insane. I've done that. I've learned that the hard way. We're not the decision makers in that process. That system exists because I think it serves some interest, right? And it's not the interest of the students. Perhaps it's something more powerful than students. So I gave up on the idea of changing it a long time ago. But if it's talking about like what people can actually, like what education should actually look like, I'm all ears for that conversation.
But it comes down to a misallocation of power, right? So power about how schools should work is currently being allocated to academics, right?
Yep,
and
sure.
to, people who have, Bill Gates, right? Bill Gates has, all of his numbers. He has his big data, and he sold everybody like, Mark Zuckerberg. He sold people on this model of like big data, and you have to understand that this is magic, right? Like the whole problem is data. Right? Like it's just being this dialing down on math, and it's like now we're going to have bigger math.
Mm-hmm.
When we have bigger math, this is, tribal shit, right? So, the story of the cargo cults?
Refresh my memory. I might have heard you talk about this before, but it's not. Go ahead.
One of my all-time favorites. Anyway, briefly, the point is that there's, there were all these Stone Age peoples in places like New Guinea. They've had no contact with the outside world for 46,000
Oh, the people
years.
who worship the military. Is that, or they worship ships?
Well, so they basically noticed that all this cargo is being dropped out of the sky, and they're like, how do we get this success? And so what they do is they build twig airplanes, and they go and they look at the landing fields. They, pick things up, and then they go and they gather around their twig airplane, and they start flapping their lips and going... and they wait for the twig airplane to take off and go get them cargo.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and this is the problem of humans having such low causal intelligence. We're very bad at figuring out why things happen. So the point is, someone like Bill Gates doesn't understand how education happens, right? He lives at this 10,000-foot view and, hasn't had to have the experience that Brett and Hunter have had to have, where we have to work with kids and we're like, these kids are miserable. Mm-hmm. Their lives suck. This is being driven by emotions, and that's why they're not trying, and I don't blame them. And the point is that we don't have a system where you and I don't have the level of power that we should have, right? It's not to say we should have all the power, but there are very specific things that we know. We know what the day-to-day experience of students is. Teachers know the day-to-day experience of students. Parents know. Students know. And the point is that at a certain point, that coalition has to get together and tell the big data crowd, like, Big data may have some role in making school better, but the major issue is, emotional and social.
Yeah.
And that's what needs to be fixed. And you fuckers don't know what you're talking about. We love you. You're great. You're members of the human family, but you have this really bad idea. And it's this bad idea that is just you flapping your lips harder. And it's, we've pursued this whole big data thing and what's easily quantifiable to the end of the line. And it's time to stop.
Sure. As much as I want to resist the temptation to say some trite libertarian thing like I'm not interested in power in your response to saying we should have more power, I really do wish I had a louder voice and that voice had more influence. But at the same time, I certainly wouldn't make the claim, and I don't think you would either, that we know the best way to educate all people. And that's a problem. I think that a system was set up where there was a claim that there was a uniform model or a mold for all people, and it failed. So the Bill Gateses of the world stepped up and said, we can build a better model to educate all the people, maybe not in the world, but certainly in the West or in the United States, and they will also fail. So, I think returning this to a smaller scale is also really, really important. I mean, the schools have been sucked away from any, local control or influence. And that was a part of the problem of the 20th century. But, the more control that the individual learner can have, or the people right around that learner, the parents or the people caring, the siblings, that's where I'd like to get to. Yeah, and if I can be influential in that process, that's great.
And crucially, the point is that, it's like any of these things. Humanity is going to do what it's going to do. Like, some people are going to go over and do that thing.
Yeah.
And, you have a choice, right? Whether you're sending your kids to, your local public school, you're sending them to private school, you're homeschooling, or you're a guy who's 45 and, just realizing that you're about to be put out of a trucking job, or you're in prison. Doesn't matter who you are, wherever you are, if you're a human, you have a choice. And to know that there are people like Brett and Katie, and apparently all of them are from New Hampshire except for me, who will teach you how to teach yourself. And that our job is to be training wheels and get you so comfortable with teaching yourselves that you don't need us.
Absolutely. But keep listening.
Well, we'll just have to find new things to talk about, Brett. But, I still want to unpack our various feelings around government.
Yeah, we can do that.
But yeah, crucially, you said at the beginning that we should collaborate, and I think we should collaborate. I would love to swap insights back and forth between our two communities, because it's only going to make both of our toolkits stronger if we're learning from each other.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And what do you think the best way to do that would be going forward?
Well, I think, what we're sort of really working on and focused on is there are a couple of things that we're doing, actually things that I think you would really love. So one, we're starting to do knowledge bombs, which are, just like short 500-word summaries of core concepts.
Yep,
so
I've listened to a few of them. Yep.
And then the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to start doing a series of articles that sort of unpack various ideas. And obviously a lot of, the screwed up intuitions that people have picked up are around education. So we're going to do a series, it's probably going to come out probably will have already come out by the time this podcast comes out, but that's going to be around IQ and race, and sort of really unpacking Charles Murray's The Bell Curve and saying, here's why that doesn't make sense. But we want to do one on what is creativity, and we want to do one on, breaking down what intelligence is. And I think it'd be really good to start to unpack some of these things, like do a series on how did the industrial school system evolve? Like these are topics, but so much of what helps people break away from the existing system is to understand what was really going on. And people need to know that history of things like, behaviorism and Ebbinghaus and, the Charles Taylors and all of that. So whatever it is, but we can be coming up with, things. I just think that a lot of it comes down to having articles at hand that are easy, or videos at hand that are easy, where you can just lay it on someone, and then you can be like, here it is in 3 minutes, go watch this sucker.
Yeah, so absolutely.
I think if we can evolve better and better tools like that, and then I'll share your stuff as it's useful, you share my stuff if it's useful, and then we'll learn from each other.
Absolutely, and we should collaborate again soon. Maybe we could cliffhang the feelings about government and get into that next time. I think people would really enjoy that conversation.
Yeah, well, and I think so much of it is how many other places are there on the internet where, individuals are willing to like actually just talk about like what feelings they picked up, how they picked them up, why, what they know and actually don't know, and willing to just sort of lay it bare.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, it's anything that I communicate is being driven by a sort of emotional undercurrent, even down to the very choices of what I choose, what information I choose to communicate. So I've gotten into trouble with people in the audience before and called a fag for talking about stuff like that. But it's one person canceled their like subscription, their monthly subscription, as a supporter of the show. I thought the person was trolling me. I didn't really believe they were sending money every month. But they said, you're being I want to say dork was the right word. You're being a dork. But I think this is really a really important conversation that we've been having on this show for years. And if it's not for everybody, that's fine. They can go somewhere else.
Well, and I think that's also part of the value is that you've been having this conversation on this show for years. We've been having this conversation on our show for years. And when it's two separate dots, it's not a line, right?
Yeah.
Like it's when you start to see like, oh, there are two communities that have been having this conversation that are totally parallel. Then suddenly, every time we started doing a Straight A Conspiracy podcast, and I keep on wanting to sing Michael Jackson's You Are Not Alone.
Mm-hmm.
And Katie keeps shutting me down. She's like, we don't have the rights to that. You can't sing that. So, but the point is that, yeah, you are not alone. And I think, if you go on the internet, it can seem like humanity is insane. But I think what you're going to find is that a very small percentage of humanity is insane. And that, most people are just being triggered or reacting to something. And they don't know how to handle this moment in history. And they just need the help of more reflective people to help shepherd them through this moment.
Absolutely. And, that's the great thing about a community is it's not all on, it's not the responsibility of who's ever on this side of the microphone. Once that community I've learned so much from the people in my community. And like I said a while ago, when I started, my affect was I'm the smartest guy. Well, that was also kind of upended by the fact that I eventually had to admit there were a lot of smarter people in my community. People, smarter, what does that mean? But people who were expert on subjects that I was not expert on, people who had more experience and wisdom. But some people are really nice and really helpful, and I get a lot of thoughtful emails. I'm sure you do as well. And I've learned a lot by, setting out now almost, 8 years ago to try and teach something. And what I got back has been far more valuable for me. So I'm absolutely willing to expand this and share this in any new direction I can.
And I'm excited to introduce anybody who in the mixed mental arts community who doesn't yet know about your show to your show.
Yeah, likewise. Absolutely. We can definitely pick this conversation up anytime. I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of feedback we both get. And we'll go from there.
And huge thanks to Drew Sample for pushing us together.
Oh, huge thanks to Drew Sample for so many things. What a great guy.
Yep. He's
awesome.
An absolute gem.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks so much, Brett.